Unexplained Oklahoma, Accounts of the Unexplainable and Odd in the Red Dirt State. Written by Jacob Stone with help from friends and family. Read by Max Powers. Introduction. This book is made up of various stories about unexplained things experienced or seen by myself or people I know. Whether they are all true or not, I am uncertain. I have rewritten some of them in an attempt to make them more concise or to make them more interesting to read, and thus some accounts I receive from acquaintances are written from the first-person perspective, and some of my own accounts may be written as if someone else is telling the story. I hope that my adjustments do not detract from the entertainment value of these stories. I have always been interested in cryptids and frightening stories that my dad would tell while we were driving. We didn't camp much, but we did spend a great deal of time in the cab of a pickup going on farm calls to his farm or to my grandparents' house, and this allowed for a lot of stories about his childhood or ghost stories. I've never been a fan of horror films or gore in films or video games, but there's a certain appeal to the unexplainable that I can't escape. I believe there is more to the universe than what we see. While I don't really believe in certain things that appear in this set of short stories, I'm also intrigued by the possibilities. This conflict between what I believe and my interest in these types of things is what has led me to seek out various accounts from acquaintances I know and trust, as well as to compile some of the more frightening or humorous stories from my dad that are related to the subject. And finally, I thought it would be interesting to account for things that have happened or seemingly happened in my home state. Oklahoma is not known for extreme landscape, but is an extremely diverse state with landforms ranging from arid mesas, sprawling grasslands, and thick cross timbers to pine-covered mountains and dark cypress swamps. The state is also home to a great deal of history that is sometimes passed by unnoticed as we learn about the centerpieces of American history. Oklahoma boasts many great and momentous things that range from unsegregated military cemeteries to oil and gas exploration, to early military scout aircraft experimentation and training. Further back in time, Oklahoma was often used by American Indians and bandits alike in several areas and for a variety of reasons. Many of the Indians were not there by choice. One could argue the bandits were. Oklahoma was the 46th state admitted to the Union, the first state to be admitted in the 20th century, and the only surrounding state that is younger is New Mexico. Due to the forgettable nature of the state of Oklahoma to outsiders and the unique history of our state, there is a great potential for the strange and unexplainable to occur here. What you will now read, if you are still interested, are compiled from first-hand accounts and are grouped by region with a brief introduction of each region. Central Oklahoma. I am generically and broadly describing this area and grouping stories into it because, quite frankly, there isn't anything spectacular about central Oklahoma. There is plenty of interest here, but whether we're in the low hills, river bottoms, cross timbers, flatlands, or the city, it all looks somewhat familiar and not at all extraordinary. I grew up in central Oklahoma, a little less than an hour east of OKC. It was a small town that we lived on the edge of, with about 10 acres that was mostly grass, with a big pond and a large wooded area beyond that. It felt like the country even though it wasn't, because the other people who owned the woods didn't do anything with it. I spent a large portion of my childhood in those woods, which were quite interesting. We could also regularly see deer and other wildlife coming out of the woods to graze or walk through the grass pasture on the other side of our pond. Our house was built sometime around, but probably after, statehood. It was very old and we know little of the history of it. It had plaster and lattice interior walls with pre-statehood bricks at the core, and some of the floors were made from lumber harvested from the creek on the property. The roof of our house collapsed when I was about 5 or 6 years old, while we were in it, and my parents decided to remodel the house and build a second story. On the south wall of the upper floor, they put in picture windows. This is the side that looked out toward the barns, the pasture, the pond, and the woods. The large windows were 6 feet wide or more, and probably 4 feet tall. There were 2 of these, and each of them was bookended by a regular opening window, something along the size of a 2840. The point is, it is a great place to sit and look through on a rainy day or in the golden hour. This will all become relevant in the stories to come. We also raised animals, mostly Dorset, Hampshire, Suffolk, and crossbred sheep, but also polled Hereford cattle, dogs, cats, chickens, etc. This is a typical sprinkling of livestock for families to raise in rural or semi-rural Oklahoma. While growing up, my family very rarely went on large vacations. My dad owned his own business, so he was extremely busy. Sometimes he would take a 2-day break from work and farming, and we would go on an overnight trip to various places in Oklahoma. That kind of trip would happen once or twice per year. We didn't just stick to central Oklahoma, but we did get to see and experience much that region of the state has to offer. I also got to spend a good amount of time in places that had historical significance but weren't really tourist attractions. For instance, on my parents' property is the foundation of an old house that was among the first in our hometown before Oklahoma was a state. The stone that was used for the foundation was hand cut. None of the rest of the house remains, just the stone. Also in my hometown was an old armory and a wall built during the Great Depression that had been used for target practice. We had bricks all over our property that were from sidewalks and roads before statehood. If I'm waxing poetic about my house and my childhood, it is because there isn't much I can think of to describe central Oklahoma in a way that is conducive to setting the stage of the stories to come. I suppose it is enough to say that the area I grew up in has a vast amount of history and sits in an interesting place very near where the boundary between Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory was once drawn. Whether that has anything to do with unexplainable events or not, we have our share of stories. The Ghost Light. This story is from my younger brother who, as far as I can tell, has never lied in his life. Maybe he has, but he even wanted to tell the truth to my parents about skipping out on work to go to the movies. I forced him to go along with my lie, and my parents found out and we got kicked out of the house. Seriously. We had to go live elsewhere. But that's how honest he is. He's also not what I would consider superstitious, and his freeze, fight, or flight reflex is in the fight sector to an absurd degree. I'm jealous of him, really. These details matter for this story because I wouldn't believe him otherwise. For many years after my parents built the second floor of our house, my brothers and I all lived up there. It is one big room with a hole for the stairs to come up basically in the middle, offset a little. I could scoot to the end of my bed and look through the hole into our den and thus out the back door of the house, though down at an extreme angle. My older brother's bed was furthest away from the head of the stairs, and my younger brother's bed was very close to the head of the stair. But my younger brother could also see down into the den and out the back door if he sat at the foot of his bed. One night I woke up and needed to pee. I don't know what time it was. I kicked my covers off and scooted to the end of the bed and sat there, yawning and stretching. I was about to put my feet down and stand up when I happened to look downstairs, and through the window in the back door I saw an orange ball of light floating. I had no idea what it was. I thought maybe Dad was outside checking animals and he was shining a flashlight at the back of the house, but it didn't look right. It was hovering in place and just bobbing around. I watched it for a couple of minutes and suddenly it shot up into the air until it was even with the picture window. It hovered there, bobbing around still, for a few minutes, and then it accelerated south across the pasture. I watched it get smaller and smaller as it rapidly traveled out over the woods. It continued to grow smaller but took a long time to disappear. I watched it until I couldn't see it any longer. I slid back up into my bed and pulled the covers up to my nose and didn't go to the bathroom. I needed to, but I didn't. I lay there awake until the sun came up. I was living in the house at the time, but he didn't tell me about this back then. It came up after we were both in college. I've asked him about it several times just to make sure I understood him and to try to gauge if he was messing with me or not. As far as I can tell, he's not. And like I said, he's an honest man. A Chupacabra? In some ways, I was a braver person when I was a teenager. Maybe I was just dumb. But when I was younger, I really, really wanted to hunt and fish. That is all I wanted to do. My family loves animals and the outdoors, but we've never been really big at that kind of thing, other than my grandfather on my mom's side. We didn't have any fancy hunting rifles, and we didn't have hunting land, and we just didn't hunt that often. My dad had farmland, and it had some wooded creeks on it and butted up next to some woods, so one year, on opening weekend, he said I could go hunt on the edge of one of his fields. I was 13, and the farm was about 45 minutes away from our house. Dad agreed to drive me down and let me camp out. At the time, I had 2 sleeping bags that my grandpa had given me. One was an Army-issue down-filled bag that I still have, and the other was a thick quilt bag. I took them both along with insulated overalls, a sweatshirt, multiple socks, other shirts, my hat, Dad's Remington 12-gauge shotgun with some slugs, a thermos of hot cocoa, orange juice, a box of those waxy chocolate donuts you can get for super cheap, some apples, a knife, and a block of cheese. Dad fed me a greasy burger at the diner at an exit off I-40 near the farm, then dropped me off at the gate. It was about 21:30, and at that hour, in late November, it's dark. This place is 80 acres, and it is split roughly by a creek into a 20-acre west part and a 60-acre east part. Along the east side of the creek, there is a high dike that was made a long time ago for flood control. On and around the creek and the dike was completely wooded. My goal was to cross the creek, which is about 8 feet down from the field, to the normally dry bottom, climb up through the woods, and camp on top of the dike. That I did. It was extremely cold, but I put the down sleeping bag into the quilt one, and fully clothed, I was warm enough. I kept the shotgun, unloaded of course, for all the people that can't continue reading without knowing that it was safe, between the sleeping bags. That night was clear, thus cold, and the stars were beautiful. Without much to do other than look at the stars, I fell asleep quickly. I awoke before dawn and opened the thermos to find the hot cocoa fully frozen. No big surprise. Perhaps if I'd have kept it in with the shotgun, it would have stayed a little warm. I ate some extremely hard donuts and a little cheese, loaded the shotgun, and started east to the larger field. I edged around the side of the field carefully until I got all the way to the eastern side, where a corner of the land sloped up into thick woods. We knew deer would use that for cover and liked to come out into the field, normally at dusk. Finding the large tree that I was looking for, I unloaded my gun, put the shells in my pocket, tied the gun to a rope and the other end to my belt loop, and climbed up to a thick branch which grew parallel to the ground. Then I pulled the gun up and loaded it. On the eastern horizon, behind the trees that were now in front of me, the sun was turning the sky orange and yellow. I couldn't see it yet, but around me the air was changing to lighter shades of gray. It was cold, very cold. I couldn't wait for the sun's rays to actually hit me and bring life back to my skin and my blood. As I sat there trying to be still and keep my eyes moving, I caught a hint of sound off to my right. Larger animals will frequently sound quiet as they step carefully through the woods or the grass, while small animals tend to bounce around and make loud noises. This was a hint of a sound. I didn't move my head at all. I moved my eyes and attempted to see if something was over that direction. For a long time I saw nothing, and my head began to hurt right behind my eyes for holding them there so long. Then I heard it again and was able to zone in on it a bit more. Slowly, I turned my head until I could look directly toward where I thought it was coming from. A dark shape moved behind tall Johnson grass and shorter bluestem. At first I thought it was a small deer. The head was low, below the grass, so I couldn't see it. I could only make out the back. It took a step and stopped. Then it took another. I heard sniffing and realized it was following the path I took to walk to my tree. Without thinking, I shifted, trying to move weight from one side of my rump to the other, and my clothing scraped some bark. The head snapped up. It was a canine of some sort, but I still couldn't make it out. It looked right at me. I'm not sure if it saw me or not, but it knew something was there. Attempting to become part of the tree, I strained all my muscles to just sit perfectly still. It seemed to take forever, but the creature finally went back to sniffing the ground and took more steps. Now it turned, still following my path, and it was coming directly towards my tree. As it got closer, I could see it was a very large animal, but almost hairless. It looked much like a mangy coyote, but was far too big. We don't have wolves in that area, not even close. I assumed it was just a big feral dog. Feral dogs scare me more than any wildlife in the area because they can be unpredictable, and this one was huge. It had long pointed ears that kept swiveling around, listening for any sounds. The tail was long and bare and kept swinging from side to side, not like an excited puppy, but almost methodically swinging. The skin appeared to be gray or grayish brown and very pale. The only substantial hair I could see atop the head, between the ears and running down the neck and between the shoulders. That hair was long and thick, but matted in places. I clicked the safety off the shotgun as quietly as I could and started to slowly lower it so I had it pointed as close as I could to the animal. The creature's head tilted at the nearly imperceptible click of the safety button, but kept walking and sniffing. It got to the tree, sniffed it, then looked up directly into my eyes. Jumping with its front legs, it leaned against the tree. The back legs were shorter than the front. Its paws were massive and the toes were longer than a dog's normally would be. The claws were as well. It stood there leaning against the tree and sniffed at me. The mouth was probably 5 feet below my dangling shoes, the front paws barely lower than my feet. The eyes were dark, but I could see black vertical slits for pupils. I was starting to tremble. The animal took a final sniff and dropped down, turned, and loped off into the woods. I trembled even more, but realized the sun had finally cleared the woods and was warming me. I was not interested in hunting any longer, but it took a very long time for me to work up the courage to climb back down out of the tree, and I didn't want to unload the shotgun to do it. I just knew the creature was waiting for me to come down. I did finally manage to unload the gun, then load it back but left the chamber empty and lowered it down to the ground. With a final look around, I climbed down, quickly grabbed the gun, and racked the action, then took off at a fast walk straight across the field. I spent the rest of the day just hanging out by my sleeping bag and watching the trees. My dad came to get me late in the day, and I just told him I didn't have any luck. About 15 years later, I may have seen it again. I was hunting the same property, but by then I had purchased a .300 Winchester Magnum that was heavy and built for long distance. I wanted to try to hunt the field by laying up on the dike. I went almost exactly to the spot I had camped at in the first story and laid down prone to watch the field. Before the sun came up, I caught some movement all the way across the field in the tall grass just outside the tree line. Through the scope, I could tell it was a large canine. It slipped through the light fog and grass and I lost it, but not before I saw the extremely large, nearly bare head, and that's the last time I saw such a creature. A ghostly dog. The sun was up, but the morning was still dim thanks to the overcast. Fog swirled around just about everything as it drifted around the barns and the trees. Gerald couldn't see the pasture, but could barely make out the tops of the trees across the pond and the upper half of the fence down by the barn. He had an odd feeling. He opened a window and listened for the sheep and could tell they were crowded together in a corner of the barn. Years of raising animals had given him the ability to detect if the sheep were frightened or if they were okay. Small sounds of their hooves stamping and their bodies shifting were clues to him, among other things. Sheep don't usually bunch like that unless they are scared or perhaps trying to get out of weather. Gerald loaded his shotgun and went downstairs. He walked out to the large barn and saw that the sheep were, in fact, huddled in a corner and all looking one direction. That's the direction you focus on in a case like this, and so he watched and waited. Before long, a large canine moved slowly out of the fog. It seemed to float as it walked smoothly without bobbing. It was the largest dog he had ever seen. The hair was patchy, darker and longer along the neck and back, but light and sparse over the rest of the body. The snout was long and thin, the eyes large and yellow, the ears very long and thin and alert. The dog looked at him and turned to walk around a fence and up the hill. Gerald followed it the best he could, but he lost track of it. He wasn't worried because the dog did not seem aggressive. However, it was such a large and odd-looking dog it made him think twice. Once he caught sight of it going up the driveway, so he went in the back door quietly and moved through the house. He opened the front door and pulled up a chair to watch for the dog out front, assuming it would continue around the house. For several minutes nothing happened but wisps of fog rolling around each other and around the cars in the driveway. Then he saw the creature's back, out in front of the porch, moving from his right to his left through the narrow front yard. The head was down so he couldn't see it, but the back towered above the brick wall at the front of the porch. The dog turned to step up onto the porch. It came right up to the door and slowly stuck its head in our house, looking directly at Gerald, who just sat there. The dog didn't act aggressively, it only stared at him, and he stared back. After a moment, the dog slowly backed out, turned around on our porch, walked out to the street, and walked down the center of it toward town. The last thing Gerald saw of the creature, it was walking down the road, seeming to float through the fog until it completely disappeared into the fog. The Rabid Skunk. One day I was feeding some of our show lambs. We would hang individual feeders very high up on a fence, and the lambs would have to stand with their front legs up on a step to reach it. This built up their muscles a little while they ate, but to get the feed and the lambs in position required me to step down off of our driveway, which was raised above the adjacent ground. The driveway was about neck or chin height for me when I was on the ground. I started helping the lambs up onto the step and tying their halters to keep them there when I saw the skunk waddling by down the center of the driveway. It was going from my left to right in the middle of the afternoon. The skunk continued to waddle along the east side of my parents' house, made the corner at the end of the dead-end street, and walked straight down the middle of the road. It was strange, but didn't rattle me very much until I saw it coming back. The sheep were nearly done eating, and I was up in our backyard when I saw it down the street. It was on an exact reverse course, straight down the middle of the street. I ran in and got my brother's single-shot .410 shotgun and loaded one shell. I put another shell in my pocket and went back just in time to see the skunk coming down the driveway. I ran well around it, keeping an eye on it to see if it saw me or if it was responding in any way. Once I was by my mom's garden, a little way down the hill, I stopped and readied the gun. The skunk walked within 5 feet of me and didn't even seem to notice me. I shot and hit it where the neck met the torso. Unfortunately, and somewhat disturbingly, it didn't die. In fact, it slowly turned toward me with a gaping, bloody hole in its neck and started walking towards me. I broke open the gun and pulled the shell, then frantically fought to get the other shell out of my pocket and into the gun. I took a couple of steps back, aimed carefully at its head, and fired. It was for sure dead this time, so I got a shovel and hauled it off to the creek and threw it in a pit we had that was filled with water. I was worried about rabies, which is the most likely explanation I can come up with for the strange behavior, so I washed the shovel off in the creek, then washed it again with the garden hose at the house. Then I washed my hands and rubbed alcohol all over my hands and arms. I hadn't touched the skunk, but it had me worried. Sometimes animals just behave strangely. I still think that skunk had rabies, but then again, maybe not. I've heard of other animals being alive when they should be dead. It is enough to cause me to think about from time to time. Invasion of the Verbascum thapsis. Spoiler alert, this story isn't actually scary or strange in the end. It's just comedic, so relax and enjoy. At one point, Dad had a land lease out of town to run cattle on. If I remember correctly, he bought a bunch of pregnant cows with the intention of keeping them over winter, allowing them to deliver their calves, weaning and feeding the calves out, then selling the calves, and finally either selling the cows or getting a bull to breed them back again. The operation was something along those lines. It was an odd property, low along the river bottom, with what we called a slough going through it. Slough is a term for a large, for our area, creek that is steep-sided, meandering, and made up of numerous branches. They are hard to cross and quite confusing because they don't just run from one side of the property to the other. It was very easy to get lost on this place if you didn't know it extremely well. Luckily, it was also not a huge property, and it had a road on one side of it, so if you did get lost, you just had to go west-ish till you found the road. The other problem with the slough was that it was hard to fence across. Fencing on the property was less than ideal to start with, and the water gaps were open. Any cow that didn't mind getting wet got out, which was most of them. They frequently got into the neighbor's wheat field, and he was understandably upset, but also not helpful and not at all kind about our attempts to get them back in and keep them there. It's not really related, but one extremely cold day we took cattle panels out and had to wade one particular water gap to try to close it off. In hindsight, it was funny. My brother and I were trying to tiptoe as the water neared the intersection of our legs, but it was just too deep, so we had to go all in. The water was just above freezing, so you can imagine, well, That was a different time. For quite a while, we just struggled to keep the cows in, which meant someone had to go check them and count them at least once per day and put them back in if they were out. This is why I don't currently raise cattle, though some of my family still do. One week, my parents left the state for a work conference. My older brother was married and doing his thing. I was in college and didn't come home that week, so my little brother got to check them. On the day this story happened, something kept him late. I don't recall if it was work or if he was hanging out with friends, but it was well after dark by the time he got around to going to check the cows. He drove an old rear-wheel drive Chevy Astro minivan that we called the Possum Van. He got out at the dirt road, opened the gate, drove the van through, and just parked it in the field and left it running. Now I have no earthly idea how a person is supposed to count cows on a property like this, even in the daylight, so counting at night is impossible. But it was required by the boss man, so we did it. I have to assume that my brother was A, making sure there were some cows there, 2, that they weren't actively attempting to escape, and D, that he couldn't see any cows not on the property. Regardless of what his ultimate plan was, he walked around the large field that his headlights were shining into and saw several head of cattle. All of them were standing around, looking at him or presumably resting, perhaps even doing some late-night grazing. My brother made a big loop around the field, wound up being satisfied that things were okay, and started to cut back through the field between the cows and his van. He was about 100 yards from the van. As he moved across, he noticed 3 tall, shadowy figures move between himself and the headlights. He stopped and turned towards them. They were too tall and thin to be people unless the light was causing issues with perspective. There were no natural animals in that area that were that tall at all. He had no idea what they were, and he started to think through his options. His only real escape was his vehicle. Turning to run into the woods left him vulnerable and stuck in the woods. He finally decided they must be people standing there, and while he had no idea what they were doing or what they wanted, he'd had enough. He mustered his most manly yell and ran straight at them. As he approached, they got thinner and thinner. If you know your Latin names for living creatures, or if you looked it up before reading this, you'll know by the title what they turned out to be. When he got very close, he realized they were just common mullein plants growing in the field. These are gross weeds that grow from a cabbage-like base but wind up with a very tall woody stalk. It's refreshing to know that my little brother's imagination can run a little wild too. But then I also have to remember that he has a more manly freeze, fight, or flight response than I do. I'm not sure I would have charged. The Stranger. My parents weren't afraid to leave us alone once we got to a certain age. I believe my older brother was 13 when it started, which made me 10 and my younger brother 7. One summer Saturday they left to go to the city for one reason or another, and we were left there with some chores to do, but with a mostly open schedule. Nothing of note happened for most of the day, but in the late afternoon we were all playing inside when we heard footsteps above us. This was after the second story was added to the house, so it could have been upstairs, or in the attic, or even on the roof, though that would be unlikely since the roof was mostly very steep. If something could get onto the very top, they could walk around there. Houses will make creaking and moaning noises frequently enough, but there's a difference between those and slow, methodical creaks that move in a straight line from one side to the other. These were the latter. We all got a little shaken up and sat still, looking at each other and listening. For a quarter hour, we did nothing but sit, and we heard nothing further. We went back to playing, and eventually we all decided to go do other things. An hour later, I went outside to a burn pile we had in our pasture. I was going to climb a big rock that was next to it and just sit there because I like doing that. My dad had been burning some brush the day before, and some of the logs were still smoldering a bit. Someone had thrown a stack of newspaper on top of the smoldering logs. They had not caught fire yet, but they were smoking. I went and got my older brother, who came to look, kicked them off, and stamped out the hot spots. That seems like such an odd thing. My dad would not have done that, and had it been him, they would have caught fire sometime in the morning, because that's when he had left. None of us did it. I can't think of any purpose anyone would have had to do it either. Not now, at any rate. At the time, I thought someone was trying to burn our property down, but there was no risk of that. At that point, we all went back inside and started whipping up some weird dinner that kids will eat if their parents are not around. The sun was setting. We were in our living room playing. The house had, at that time, a partial wraparound porch that started on the front, north side, in front of the living room and dining room, then wrapped around the kitchen to the east side, where it dropped down some steep steps to the backyard. As we were sitting in the living room, I saw a man with a cowboy hat walk past the kitchen window on the front, then past the kitchen window on the side. I never saw him pass the door from the kitchen to the porch, which was at the top of the steps. The figure would have either had to stop between the window and the door, or would have to jump over the edge of the porch into the driveway. It was about a 6-foot jump, which isn't bad, but we didn't hear anything. I told my brothers. My older brother quickly ran to the dining room phone, which was tethered to a wall back then, and called the couple that my parents had lined up for our emergency contact. By the time they got there, it was dark. The man got a flashlight and looked all around the house and out into the barns. He didn't see anything. They offered to stay with us till my parents got home, but my older brother declined. Nothing else happened that night, but there were many other occasions where I heard footsteps above me. I've also never seen any other unexplained people around the house. I have heard footsteps above me since then. I should say that I've heard things that sounded like footsteps that were obviously not a squirrel, which has a distinct sound. The most recent time I thought I heard footsteps was at my current house, and they were quickly followed by an actual earthquake. It was odd that the sound of creaking and thumping that preceded the earthquake moved in a straight line, jumping a few feet for 3 distinct steps. Then all was silent for about 10 seconds, then the earthquake happened. I don't find that to be frightening or supernatural, it's just strange. The Riddle House Haunting. After my first son was born, my wife and I were nearly broke and struggling. We both had jobs that didn't pay much for people with children to care for, and we needed to get our feet under us. Several years earlier, Mom and Dad had purchased a rental property down the street from their house, and my dad and older brother were managing it around the time our son was born. They had recently had their renters move out, so they told us we could stay there, and then they didn't charge us rent. We set a little aside to pay my brother, who actively refused the money, but even had we paid them, it would have been a sweet deal. We stayed there for 2 years, and it made a very huge difference in allowing us to save a bit of money to buy our first house. I have no idea how old this house actually was. There was a pasture and some very old, low sheds behind the house. Originally a mirrored duplex, someone had torn down the center wall in the living room and converted one kitchen into a hallway that really couldn't be used for much else but storage. It wound up being a decent 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a small kitchen and gaps in the walls that would move your curtains and bed sheets when the wind blew. At the front of the house there were 2 very large window units, one in each side of the original duplex. Each of the original living rooms also had an old gas wall furnace. We added a small window unit to my son's bedroom off the kitchen. My wife insisted on having one of those baby monitors. I felt the house was small enough and the walls were thin enough that we'd hear anything going on, but she won the argument for a bit. But just like so many people report, we heard all kinds of weird noises and quiet voices on the baby monitor, so we eventually just turned it off. It was creepy. We explained it away as picking up radio waves, which I still believe is the best explanation. However, one night my son started crying uncontrollably. At that time, we were having some issues getting him to sleep, but the crying was different. It wasn't a hungry cry, or a discomfort cry, or even a I want to be held kind of a cry. It was more like screaming. It was odd. I went quickly through the house to his side and turned on his light. He was holding himself upright, standing in his crib, holding onto the rail, and he was staring up to where the wall met the ceiling just above the east window. Stepping up to the side of the crib, I got my face down close to his. "What's wrong? It's okay. It's okay." He leaned to the side to look around my head and continued screaming. I looked over my shoulder, not quite sure what I expected to see, and there was nothing there. Looking back at him, I leaned to get in his way again, and he leaned the other way and continued screaming. I picked him up out of the crib and held him to my chest with his head on my shoulder, which meant he was screaming in my ear. He started grabbing wildly with his hands as well. I turned my body around and looked back up toward where he had been looking, and still I saw nothing. As I turned, he turned his head until he couldn't look at that spot anymore, and then he started fighting like mad to get his body twisted around to see it. Turning from side to side, I watched him fight to always see that one spot. Then I walked around the room, and his head followed it. I didn't see anything up there. Finally, I carried him out of the room. Halfway through the kitchen, he started to instantly calm down. He took some deep breaths, sighed a few times, shuddered a bit, and then stopped fidgeting. I sat down on the couch, and my wife asked me what was wrong. I don't know. He just kept screaming at a spot on the wall. I'm not sure she believed me, but I explained it all. She got a funny look on her face, then she went back to watching TV. I eventually put our son back in his crib while he was asleep, and that was that. For the next 16 months or so, nothing like that ever happened again. We eventually bought a house in another town and started boxing things up and getting ready to move. Our new house wasn't ready to live in yet, but we had moved all of our kitchen and dining room stuff as well as all of our son's bedroom furniture to the new house. It was early July and it was hot. The front window units weren't working well, and since our son's crib had been moved, we were all in our bed, sweating and having trouble sleeping. I couldn't take it, so I went to my son's room and laid on the floor because it still had the small window unit that could cool me off some. I could not fall asleep there, and as I rolled around on the floor, I became more and more uneasy. Suddenly, I got the feeling that something was there, and whatever it was wanted me gone. I never saw anything. Nothing ever touched me. It was a feeling of intense dread that I've never felt before or since, and it seemed to come from the spot above the east window where the wall and the ceiling met. I tried to control my mind and force myself to be rational. It was all in my head. There wasn't anything there. I don't believe in that kind of supernatural event. No matter what I thought or what I did, I could not shake the feeling. When I finally had enough, I got up and walked into the living room. Before I made it through the kitchen, I felt fine. I laid down on the living room floor and I almost instantly fell asleep. We moved the rest of the stuff the next day, and I've never slept in that house again. To my knowledge, nobody has. They never rented it out after that. I'm not sure anyone else has ever experienced what my son and I did, and my son doesn't remember it. The Deerhunt Demon. A friend of mine from college is an avid hunter. He always has been. Once he told us of a time he decided to go bow hunting. It happened to be the weekend of the time change, and he wound up confused about when the sun was coming up, which meant he got to his hunting spot earlier than he needed to. It was dark and he couldn't see, but he wanted to get to his stand. He got his bow and arrows and his knife and set off through the woods. He managed to get close to his stand, but couldn't see well enough to locate the exact tree, much less climb into it. Therefore, he just put his back to a tree and waited for it to get a little lighter. Not long after that, he heard something walking up toward the tree he was leaning against. Assuming it was a deer, he just sat and listened. It was too dark to shoot it, so he had no reason to draw his bow. Slowly it advanced until it sounded to be directly behind the tree. He knocked an arrow at that point, but still felt there was no reason to draw or to move. For several moments there was nothing. Then suddenly, whatever it was screamed. My friend described it as sounding like the horrific scream of a tormented woman, mixed with guttural sounds like something choking on thick liquid. The thing screamed again and started walking around the tree. At this point, he drew the bow back and quickly stepped out from the tree, spinning around as he did so. He could see nothing. The creature, whatever it was, paced back and forth less than 5 feet in front of him. It was making low growling noises. He just stood there with the bow drawn, afraid to fire because he had no idea what it was, and he didn't want to anger it. After several moments of terror, the thing gave one last growl and walked away. He kept his bow drawn back for a few minutes until he felt it was relatively safe. He put his back to the tree again, and as soon as he had enough light to see, he walked quickly to his pickup and drove home. There's been a lot of speculation, debate, and argument in the past about the presence of big cats in Oklahoma. My father has seen large black cats when he was young. I know many other people who have seen mountain lions. My brother has seen a mountain lion while checking some ranch land in central Oklahoma. Many people have caught them on game cameras. My friend believes he was face to face with a large cat, probably a mountain lion, on that morning. It makes sense, and we all agree that's probably what it was. It is plausible that his cover scent either intrigued it or confused it, and as it got closer, perhaps it caught the scent of man, and that is why it screamed and paced around before leaving. In any case, I hope that it wasn't anything worse, and I'm happy it was him and not me. That is a situation I never want to be in. The Stranger, number 2. I never saw any strange people, real or ethereal, since the day I saw the cowboy walking around my parents' porch. However, my little brother once again had a strange encounter after I had gone off to college, and he was responsible for chores. After Mom and Dad bought the rental property, they started using the pasture behind it for extra grazing land for the sheep. They put grain in one of the low sheds behind the house and let the sheep take shelter in the other one. There was a dirt and gravel alleyway that went along the western side of the house and pasture, and it had a really dim streetlight on a pole along it very near the shed that they kept grain in. At night, the light was just bright enough to ruin your night vision, or purple vision as we called it. If a person went into the shed, they could see nothing. Normally, the biggest concern would be rat snakes that like to crawl in and lay on 2x4s in the walls, hunting the mice that naturally come in to get grain and hay. Not that the snakes would intentionally bother you, and they aren't dangerous, but you might accidentally grab one and get a good shock, and maybe a bite. They will lay above the door frames or window frames, or on rafters, if the building has them. There was another concern, unlikely though it might be. If someone hid inside any of those sheds, a person would not be able to see them at all when walking in. It would take several minutes for a person's eyesight to adjust. For these reasons, my brother always tried to get these sheep fed before the sun went down. However, he was very busy with school and 4-H projects, and since he was the last son at home, there was nobody to share the load on the chores. One night, he had to go feed them while it was dark. He had memorized where the different feed bags were, so he could get the feed ready in complete darkness. Going in the shed, he started preparing the buckets, but he had a very odd feeling. He felt uneasy and uncomfortable. Something was wrong. There was a small window at the back of the shed, and he looked out it but saw nothing. He tried to check the other room that was in the shed, which was mostly used for barrels and tools that we didn't need very often, but he couldn't see anything. He continued mixing feed and finally had it all ready. Exiting the barn, he was confronted with a strange man leaning against the corner post, just feet away, watching him. He had never seen this man before, and they stared at each other for a moment. My brother said he was not going to turn his back, and so he just stood there. Finally, the man straightened, turned around, and walked away. My brother never saw him again. The Nightstalker. This story was handed down from my grandpa to my dad to me and my brothers. I have no way to corroborate it, but it is plausible and even likely. My grandpa's mother was single after her husband died, and my grandpa and his siblings were relatively young. They lived on a farm in what would be considered southeastern Oklahoma, but biased toward the center part of the state. They weren't so far down to be in the mountains and hills that occupy that particularly fascinating corner of our state. The country was living through the Great Depression at that time, and most rural families had very few options. They ate what they grew or harvested and nothing else. They wore clothes made from feed sacks or hand-me-downs. They would eat as much of what they had as they could. Dad even showed me how they used to make gravy from coffee grounds because that's the only way they could get gravy to put on their bread. It was something that tasted different, he explained. At the time of this story, my dad's grandmother was trying to raise a young family on a small farm. She was small of stature but very tough by necessity. She also had to protect her family, her property, and her stock by necessity. This meant keeping loaded guns around and regularly checking stock morning, noon, and all night. After all, there were predators that wanted a meal too, and some of those were other poor folk willing to steal a lamb or chicken or calf to stay alive another few days. One night there were lines of storms rolling in, as is common in the Midwest. After a particularly nasty thunderstorm had passed and the rain was dying down, my great-grandmother went out to the barn to check the stock. The chickens were all in the coop. The sheep were in the shed. The cattle seemed okay. As she stepped into one of the rooms of the barn, however, she saw a calf upside down in a corn feeder. If you're familiar with these types of feeders, you'll know that the animals can't get in them at all. It would be even more impossible for them to get in upside down. In fact, that was a common way for people to quickly butcher animals to get some meat quickly. They would not butcher their own animals that way, but if a person were in a hurry, doing it in that manner would hold the victim relatively still while they could cut its throat and get some of the meat before making a getaway. The calf had been placed there by a human for the purpose of butchering it. She quickly lifted the calf out of the feeder and put it over the gate into the pen with the other cattle, did a quick look around the barn, then hurried back up to the house and checked on her children. All was well, so she went to bed. After a couple more hours, she woke and went back out to check again. The rain had finally stopped completely. As she approached the barn, she noticed there were boot prints in the mud leading out the door and down the driveway. Whoever was trying to butcher the calf had been in the barn when she saved it. When she opened the door, there was the calf, dead and partially butchered in the feeder. The baby in the ditch. One night I was doing our chores late, which consisted of feeding sheep and dogs, ensuring they all had access to water, and making sure everything was basically in the right pens. I wound up going around the house to the front door to go inside, and I don't remember why. As I came around the side of the house, I heard a baby crying in the ditch across the street. There was a pasture over there and a small house that a weird lady was living in. She wasn't as weird as I thought she was, but at the time, it was weird. I was scared and thought about going to get my dad, but I also felt like I needed to go check on it if it was a baby. With that in mind, I slowly crossed the street, walking somewhat on my tiptoes and stretching to try to see into the ditch. I did not want to approach, but I knew I had to. I didn't know what I would do when I found it either. As I was close to being able to see into the ditch, a stray cat came shooting out of it and took off into the night. That's when I remembered that my dad had told me once about cats sounding like babies or women crying. I'd never heard one do that before. I then quickly checked the ditch to make sure nothing else was in it and ran into the house. A mystery animal. Our dad told us of times growing up when he heard or saw large, black cats in central and southeastern Oklahoma. He saw one drinking from a river once in the daytime, but his best story was from a time he and my uncle, one of Dad's younger brothers, had to go check animals at night. They grew up on a farm where they raised a lot of animals. I know they had a lot of pigs and the other normal things like chickens and ducks. I don't know what else they raised at that time. It was the kids' job to feed and water everything at night, and they also had to regularly check things through the night. On the night in question, it was late and very dark. They went and started looking through the pens and barns, and everything was there, but slightly agitated. Nothing was jumping around or trying to get out, so it wasn't that bad, but they started getting unnerved just thinking about what could be out there. As they looked around, they were talking and trying to scare each other, and it started working. My uncle was faster than Dad, and when they were done, he took off for the house as fast as he could. Dad was trying to catch up, but couldn't, and as he ran, he said that he thought he heard something running behind him. As you can guess, it turned out to just be in his mind, or maybe it was an echo of his own footsteps, but it urged him on. When they were a little over halfway up the hill, they heard a cat scream from the creek just past their barns. Dad said it sounded like a woman shrieking, but he knew it to be a large cat from things my grandpa had told him. The scream caused my uncle to look over his shoulder, and he missed seeing how close he was to the clothesline. It caught him on the neck and flipped him up. He landed on his back, and my dad ran by. Dad got to the back door of their house and went in, locking it behind him. My uncle had to get up and run around to the front door to get in. No animals were hurt that night, and Dad tells it as a funny story, but I remember being quite frightened when he told me that as a child. They had apparently seen other large cats and had some stock taken away from time to time. It was a serious concern for them. Now looking back on this story, it just strikes me as funny and a little disturbing that my dad would lock my uncle out at a time like that. Office creeps. I work in an office on the outskirts of a large town in north central Oklahoma. Our office building is not located in what I would call the country because the town has grown out towards it, and there's a lot of traffic on the road in front of the building. However, it is set back up in some trees, and you can barely see one other building from where we are located if you happen to have an office on the south side of the building. It's a large building that has been added onto numerous times. It started off as a house, but over time has been converted into an oddly laid out building. Eventually, my company added a very modern front onto it. For a long time, we had about 60 people working in it, and it was fairly full with various offices, conference rooms, and cube farms. At a point, we started having to turn conference rooms into offices as our staff grew. When I first started working here, I was on our customer support team, and during the busy season, we would have a person work every Saturday morning for about 2 months or so. Since I was new and I wanted to make extra money, I volunteered for most of these days. I would be completely alone in the building for 4 hours. It was creepy because any building does make noise, and there were so many dark offices, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I was in the newer part of the building too, and never had to go into the old part. Additionally, even though it was our busy time of year, Saturdays were still slow, which meant I spent most of my time watching YouTube videos or Netflix waiting on a call. I later transferred to a different department and worked downstairs in a part of the new building. Then COVID came around, and the company said we could all work from home, and all of us did. For about a year and a half, nobody went into the office. Even after COVID was no longer big in the news, most of us were content to stay home, and the company couldn't really make a good argument why that was a bad thing. However, I did feel the desire to get out of the house some, so I worked with my boss, and we set up a new office at the very back of the building where we could work when we wanted to get out of the house, and we both started a schedule where we'd go in 2 or 3 times a week. Now most days there are a few people working up towards the front of the building, and sometimes our customer support staff will come in and work in a room upstairs that is about halfway through the length of the building. But there are many offices that are completely empty. There's a very large original room above my new office that is always empty. That being part of the original building, it creaks and groans if anyone goes up there, which is rare. Nobody ever has a reason to. That brings us up to date. One day my boss and I were both working, and the CEO was up in his office at the front. Sometime during the day he left, though we didn't know till the doorbell rang and I had to make the 100-yard hike through the winding corridors to get the UPS delivery. That left me and my boss. We continued working and jumping in online meetings through the afternoon, and then he left me to run some errands. It wasn't until then that I realized I was all alone in the building. It just seemed funny at the time since there's space for so many, but I was all alone. My boss came back and finished out the day, but I was in the zone getting some work done, so I decided to work late and try to finish up that stage of my project. I had my headphones on listening to music, cranking away on my computer, and didn't really notice the sun going down and the light fading. Then I noticed a loud thump on the ceiling above me. I took off my headphones and looked up. There was no sound for a very long time. Then suddenly, the boards started creaking, and I heard something dragging across the floor above me, slowly. It stopped every few seconds, but would always start back up again. I'll admit my heart was racing and I was frightened, but I assumed it was someone who snuck back in and was moving furniture. After all, since nobody really works here anymore, we all consider the empty offices fair game for stealing desks, chairs, computer monitors, etc. Another thing about my offices that I perhaps shouldn't commit to record, but is important here, is that they have no policy on licensed firearm carry at work. They just don't have a rule at all. I'm licensed, so most days I have my pistol on my person when I'm at work. This made me feel better in this particular case, so I decided to go check it out. No, I didn't draw my gun. I was still working under the assumption that the most likely explanation was the true one, and it was just a coworker moving furniture. I started up the steps, and you just can't go up those steps quietly, so whoever was in the room was bound to hear me. I made the corner into the short hallway at the top of the stairs and went through the door. What remained of the evening light was pouring through the only windows in that room, which were on the opposite end from where I entered, about 30 feet away. Nobody was there. The remaining furniture had all been shoved against the left and right walls. The sound I had heard would have been toward the right, but close to the center of the room, but nothing was there. I reached over and turned on the light. The only thing I thought I saw was a swirl of dust in the middle of the room, but it was gone so fast I assume it was my imagination. I walked through the room, checking among the clutter along both walls. Nothing. I walked out of the room, turning the light off as I went, and as I turned the corner to go downstairs, I suddenly felt like something was coming at me. I turned and reached for the grip of my pistol, not drawing it, but just preparing. I can't explain it any other way than just a sudden fear of impending danger. But nothing was there. I hurried downstairs and went out some doors to the exterior that were right by the base. I checked the parking lot, and the only car was mine. I pulled my key card out of my pocket and scanned it to get back in the building, but nothing happened. I scanned it again and nothing happened. Normally it lights up even if the door doesn't unlock. I tried it a few more times and it finally beeped, and I heard the lock thump, so I pulled the door open, but it felt restricted, like there was something wrong with it. Quickly I jogged to the end of the hallway and into my office, ripped the power cord out of my laptop to disconnect it from the docking station, grabbed my backpack and took off. I had to go back down the hallway to those same doors. As I turned the corner out of my office, I heard the dragging noise upstairs again, then another thump. I did not stop. I was nearly running by this point. Halfway down the hallway, what looked like a wisp of smoke or fog came down the stairs and billowed into the hallway against the doors I had to use. I didn't know what else to do, so I just went for it. I hit the door at an angle and pushed it open. Again there was resistance and the door fogged up in front of my face, but I was able to get out. I ran to my car and got in and left. As I was going through the parking lot to the driveway, all feelings of danger left, but I was still shaken up and frightened. I don't go to the office anymore unless someone else is there, and if they leave, I leave. An invisible construction site. My little brother and his friend were cruising around one night and decided to hit the country roads and see if they could explore a bit. There were stories about a bridge east of our hometown out in the country that was haunted, and a graveyard haunting in the same area, so they went out looking for that or whatever else they could find. Both of these kids were smart, good kids and not prone to getting scared or causing trouble. They were just exploring. For several hours they just cruised around the dirt and gravel roads, talking and not finding much interesting. They wound up down by a river that had extremely limited bridge crossings, and there are a lot of dead-end roads in that area. They had to backtrack in a few places, and they wound up a bit turned around. They weren't lost, because they could always just drive away from the river and eventually find a highway. However, they didn't know exactly where they were. At one point they hit a curve in the road that turned them 90 degrees and started down a hill, but as they came around the corner they saw two construction barriers across the road. These were the road closed signs that consist of a couple of horizontal striped boards and flashing lights on top. My brother started to put the car in reverse to turn back around when his friend said, "Hey wait, I'm going to get one of those flashing lights." My brother put it in park with his headlights pointing down the road at the signs, and his friend jumped out, leaving the door open. As the friend walked toward the signs, he looked back at my brother with a look of confusion on his face. Turning the radio down, my brother heard construction noises coming in the open passenger door. He rolled his window down and leaned his head out. There were the sounds of machines running and the distinct sounds of voices chatting over radios. It all sounded very close, as if it was just down the hill. He looked at the clock. It was 11:45 p.m. His friend had decided to go forward with trying to liberate the light from the sign and was yanking on it repeatedly. My brother listened again to the sounds of machinery running and the sounds of voices, and realized he could see no light. Nothing was visible except dark trees and night sky, aside from what showed in his headlights. He got out of the car and looked around behind them. Nothing that way either. "Dude, let's go." The friend stopped yanking on the light and looked around. "Dang, yeah, this is weird." He rushed back to the car and they both jumped in and left. They kept an eye out and never saw any actual construction sites. My brother decided to try to drive around that mile section to approach from the other side, but no matter how they drove, they couldn't find it. Eventually they gave up. A few days later, on the weekend, they drove back out to look for it and could never find that road again. He told me about it a week or so after that. My job allowed me access to some very recent satellite imagery, so we scoured the area looking for either oil drill sites or construction sites. We used the imagery sources, county section maps, and plat maps to try to locate where they were. I still believe it was an oil drill operation. Those operate all hours until they get the well set, but they usually have lights and they usually don't close down roads. We never found anything, even looking for hours and hours until we had searched everything within miles of the river, all the way to the next county. One day this event came up while we were all hanging out, and our other brother said he had similar experience while out inspecting wells for his job. It was late, he ran into a road closed sign that shouldn't be there. He got out to investigate it and heard voices over radios that were all very loud. There were no lights, he saw no equipment, no movement, no signs of anything happening. None of us have any idea what the explanation for it really is, and we've not found anything like it since then. Wichita Mountains. If you are driving southwest on I-44 from Oklahoma City, you will suddenly reach a point where mountains seem to spring out of the arid ground in front of you. As you get closer, it will become apparent that these mountains are either made up of or covered in large granite boulders and blackjack oak trees. The views are beautiful and breathtaking, but different than most mountain ranges you will see anywhere in the world. If you swing through Medicine Park, you will notice buildings made of uniform spherical rocks. These are natural and not crafted by the hand of man. If you drive or hike up Mount Scott, you will see the majority of the mountain range and the flatlands around it. Stopping by Fort Sill would give you insight into the military history of the region, which includes dealing with American Indians of the area, early military aviation, and artillery training throughout the decades, as well as the final resting place of Geronimo. The Wichita Mountains were once thought to contain rich gold deposits, and though that did not turn out to be true, there are multiple stories about hidden and potentially enchanted gold stashes. Believe the stories, or don't, but if you happen to be in the mountains at dusk, take a moment and listen, and you will be left with the undeniable feeling that there is more surrounding you than you can see, touch, smell, and hear. A dimensional portal. My first college roommate at Oklahoma State University lived in Lawton. In the early spring of our freshman year, he invited me to go camping at Camp Doris in the Ouchita Mountain Wildlife Refuge. I had not been camping in a very long time, but I wanted to start, so I agreed to go. We arrived late on a Friday night and set up our camp, then stayed up far too late in the night, being louder than we should have been, chasing possums through the campground and lighting eastern red cedar branches on fire. I apologized to the couple who were camping nearby and were probably trying to spend some quiet time together. On Saturday, my friend took me to the Elk Mountain area, and we decided to hike the Charon Gardens area and the boulder fields. After spending some time there, we hiked back north toward the parking lot and decided to attempt to climb a large tower of boulders. I'm usually a pretty good climber, and though I'm technically afraid of heights, it isn't a debilitating fear. I like climbing trees, enjoy hiking in the mountains, love roller coasters and flying, and generally don't have issues when I'm up on top of things. We started up in the late afternoon and very quickly branched off. He liked a line taking him around to the north and east side of the rock face, while I preferred a line on the west side. When I was roughly 3/4 of the way up to the top, I suddenly started getting dizzy. I had never had vertigo before this time, but it hit me pretty rapidly and without warning. I tried to continue, but could not. Luckily, I found a flat shelf that was roughly 5 feet deep and 8 or 10 feet wide. I sat down with my back to the rock and looked out to the west and the setting sun. My dizziness continued to grow despite sitting down. Suddenly, I grew cold, and my view started shimmering like I was looking into a mirage. I assumed it was merely the vertigo causing the shimmer, even after the mountains to the west started to become a deeper green, as if the grass and trees were healthier and more abundant. I closed my eyes. The dizziness continued to deepen. My skin grew colder, and I began to shiver. I began to hear a throbbing noise around me, and it slowly resolved into what sounded like distant chanting, but in a language I did not understand. Suddenly, something touched my left arm. I flinched and felt my arm tear away from it as I opened my eyes and looked. There was a face, dark and brown, with dark hair and dark eyes, looking at me with a confused look, possibly an angry look. The face was there, but also shimmering, and the color of it seemed muted. Within a second, the eyes grew very large, the mouth opened slightly. The face drew back and disappeared, as if the rock wall swallowed it up. I was now hot and sweating. The shimmering was gone. I was still slightly dizzy, but I slid my body to the western edge of the shelf of rock and looked down. 8 feet below was another shelf. I dropped off and landed onto it. I ensured that I allowed my body to go flat against the shelf to keep my momentum from carrying me off the lower edge. It was over 20 feet down from there. I was already feeling better, so I turned and slid backwards over the edge, found a foothold, and started down. I got down as fast as I could, and about the time I touched flat-ish earth, I heard my friend shouting and looked up. He was waving from atop the tower of rock. "Are you coming up?" he yelled. I just shook my head no and sat down. I watched as he looked around and took in the views, and then as he disappeared down the backside of the tower. As the sun set, I began to feel uneasy, but he joined me before it got dark, and we returned to his '68 Chevy pickup and drove back to camp. I did not sleep much that night and did not tell him for many years about what happened. When I did discuss it with him, he did not sound surprised or like he didn't believe me. Apparently, several members of his family had experienced similar things, though none of them had seen any humanoids, and none of them had ever felt like they were touched from another dimension. I've been back to that area a number of times and have never had a similar experience, though I've not gone back to that exact spot. A Deerman in camp. I have a friend whose family leased several properties south of the Ouchita Mountains Wildlife Preserve for grazing cattle. After a few camping trips where we camped elsewhere, we decided to start camping on the lease land because we could shoot guns and hunt and be loud and obnoxious on those properties. The first camp we set up on was a beautiful 320-acre property covered mostly in thick trees, blackjack and others of the gross oak family, with some open grass pastures, a few ponds, and a really cool dry creek bed running through it. We found a nice campsite under the eaves of the woods along the edge of a small clearing atop a hill. To get to that campsite, one would drive through the south gate, through the largest open area on the property, up a hill, through a cut in an arm of the wooded area into a smaller clearing, then around some trees to park near the small clearing we camped by. The location was very secluded, invisible from the road, and near the drive that made a loop through the property from south gate to north. It was also a short walk from the camp to the dry creek bed. The property was very cool to camp on, but was also strange. There were a few items we found on the property over the years. Once my friend showed me a bowling ball on a stump in the middle of the woods. He knew of it and had visited it numerous times, but still had trouble finding it to show me. What its purpose was or who put it there, nobody knew. We had been camping on the property for about 5 years, at least twice a year, by the point of this account. I was working at a bank and was getting burned out. It was November and I had PTO to use up, so I decided to take Friday off and go camping early. All my other friends had to work, so I was going to be there by myself for Friday evening and Saturday morning, and they would all arrive sometime Saturday. This was after the autumn time change, and I arrived late just after the sun had gone down. I did not have time to set up my tent. I decided to sleep in the bed of my pickup. I did not realize that the front of my pickup was slightly downhill, and I slept with my head in that direction. The night was chilly but not severe, and I fell asleep quickly. I woke up just after midnight with a splitting headache, presumably from the blood pooling in my brain. I slid my boots on, crumpled up my sleeping bag, and moved up to the passenger side of the cab. I was about to open the door when I heard an eerie call from the woods. It started low and guttural, but quickly climbed to a high-pitched call like someone scraping a chalkboard. It sounded like an elk bugle, though I did not believe elk ranged the flatlands south of the preserve. I heard crashing through the woods away from me, and then silence. Feeling happy about hearing an elk, I clambered into the pickup and spent the next 10 minutes trying to wriggle into my sleeping bag and get it pulled up above my shoulders so I could get my head covered. Eventually I did, and the pain in my head started to reside, and so I leaned my head against the side window and fell asleep. When I was a kid, I could sleep like that, but at this point I was 26 years old, and I got a crick in my neck. I woke up cold and uncomfortable and started to shift my body. When I did, I heard a metallic scrape from the driver's side of the truck. I stopped moving and shifted my eyes to look out, but saw nothing. For a few minutes, there was absolute silence. Then a footstep in the leaves. This sounded large, but it was a single footstep sound. I had no idea what it was. A few minutes later there was another, and a grunt, then sniffing. I eyed my Mossberg 500 shotgun that was leaning against the driver's side seat, loaded but not chambered. Then my H&K USP 45, loaded and chambered, on my dash. I made no move to grab either, however. I continued to listen and look around with my eyes. I heard nothing else at that time, and so shifted around and got as comfortable as possible before falling back asleep. Sometime later I awoke again. In my mind it seemed I had heard a noise, but I could not be for sure until there was a snorting noise just outside my pickup. I was still a bit sleepy, and I panicked a little and reached out of my sleeping bag to hit the lock button on my pickup. The thump of the lock sounded extremely loud in the still night and was followed immediately by the sound of a footfall in the leaves again on the driver's side. Now I was fully awake. I looked directly out my driver's side window while I reached slowly for the holstered pistol on my dash. Outside there was no moon and I was surrounded by trees, so I could see nothing. There was a slow scraping noise, as if something were dragging on the metal of the door. Something tugged on my door handle and the pickup rocked slightly. I drew the pistol and brought my upper body fully out of the sleeping bag, took the best two-hand grip I could from that position, swept the safety off, pulled the hammer back, and pointed the gun at the driver's window. In the same quick span of time there was a rustling noise that receded into the woods to my north, then silence. I sat for some time, not daring to move. Eventually, my eyes began to get heavy, as did the pistol, but I tried to stay alert until I heard a whippoorwill calling nearby. That isn't exactly a happy sound at night, but it meant nothing dangerous was about. I made the pistol safe and holstered it, then I fell back asleep and did not awake again till the cold gray of morning. I got up and relieved myself first, stamped my feet and tried to warm them up, drank some water, then walked around the pickup looking for any signs of what could have been there. I found nothing. I collected some materials and started a fire, ate breakfast, set up my tent, and walked around the area some. Then I got out a shovel and axe and began making a lean-to. I had only built one with my dad before, so this one wasn't great. Besides, the ground was very hard and the trees are all scrubby oaks. At lunchtime I broke out an old MRE, which happened to be the first I'd ever eaten. It was okay. I liked it well enough. Then I attempted to start a friction fire and failed, as most people do when they don't know what they're really doing. I got up and hiked around a bit and wondered where my friends were. Late in the afternoon I began to get nervous. It is about a 2.5 hour drive from where we all lived to this place, and I had assumed my friends would leave around noon. They should have been there. I got out my cell phone and called one of them, but got no answer. I could text, but this was back in the day when every text cost you, so I didn't. I milled around camp a bit more, but as the sun started to dip behind the trees to my west, I got extremely nervous. It is an old and tired trope, but I did in fact feel like someone was watching me. I felt like I had no privacy at all, but I was utterly alone. I had almost decided to walk the nearly half-mile to the gate when I noticed the woods around me were silent again. I had my pistol on my hip, but I quickly grabbed my SKS rifle that was leaning against a tree, slung a backpack over my shoulder, and set out at a fast walk. I had to hike back around some trees and through the woods where the driveway cut them. The opening in the trees is about 1.5 car widths wide. It is about 20 yards through that gap. I have rarely felt more vulnerable than I did walking through that gap in the fading light, but I headed through it and down the hill, looking out across the pasture. My head was on a swivel and looked for movement or anything out of the ordinary. While still in the long shadows of the trees behind me, I looked back. At first, I saw nothing strange, but as I started to turn my head back to the front, my eye caught what looked like antlers. My nervousness turned to excitement. It was deer season, and I had a lifetime hunting license. My SKS was not the best gun for the job, at least not with the ammunition I had loaded, but a clean kill could be made. I put the gun at low ready and aligned my finger with the safety lever, the best rifle safety lever in existence. Looking closely, I tried to pick the antlers apart from tree limbs. They were definitely antlers, mostly symmetrical. There was the head looking out beside a cedar tree. Due to the sun being low behind the animal and the trees, I could not make out any other detail. Suddenly, the head rose and looked at me just over the cedar tree it had been peeking behind. I could not see the base of the tree because it was hidden behind the hill, so I couldn't really see how tall the animal was, but it seemed to be a large deer. I could not see the body, just the head and antlers. I was contemplating taking a shot at it. Usually, you would attempt a body shot to hit it in the heart and lungs. I could not see them, and with my ammunition, a headshot would be the best bet. It would mess up any chance of a good mount, but I was broke and couldn't afford that kind of thing anyway. I just wanted the meat. I started to raise the gun, and the animal turned and ran off to my right. The gait was very odd, but I could barely keep up with it as it went behind a lot of oak trees. I kept my eyes on where I thought it would be, and just made sure it didn't pop back out into the pasture area to the north. Often deer will do that kind of thing. After a few moments with no re-emergence of the deer, I noticed my nervousness was back. I double-checked the safety on the SKS and started back toward the south gate. I arrived a few minutes later and just sat with my back against the latch post. I checked my phone again. Nothing, and very little signal anyway. I tried to call my friends again. No answer. The sun was fully down now, with the orange and pink and violet glow over the hill and trees on the western horizon. To the east, the sky was dark, and stars were showing. It would be a cold night. By the gate, I felt much less nervous, but I was dreading walking back in the dark. I had no idea where my friends were, or if they had decided not to come down at all. We had to head back the next day anyway. I sat at the gate for about a half hour when I heard a vehicle coming down the gravel road and then saw the glow of headlights. I didn't want to stand up with a gun in my hand in case it wasn't them, so I waited for them to pull up to the gate. I peeked out to ensure it was my friend's pickup, then I stood up and opened the gate. My friends were a bit startled by a guy popping up out of the grass, but we had a good laugh. Theirs genuine, mine nervous. I did not tell them why I was there. I just said I had gotten bored. They pulled through the gate, I closed it, and then jumped in the truck bed, and they drove up the camp. The next day we were doing some target shooting, and I walked over to the cedar tree I had seen the animal behind. It was the only cedar tree in that part of the woods, besides a few tiny saplings. It was about 6.5 feet tall. The animal I had seen would have been at least 7. There are no white-tailed deer that tall. We never saw or heard any sign of whatever that was again that weekend. I never got the nervous feeling and eventually attributed it to me being alone in the woods for so long. However, I know the things I heard and saw were really there, so each time we camp in that area it does enter my mind. However, we moved to a new camp not long after, and I've not been to that spot in many years. The Mount Scott Mystery. There was once, many years after the bizarre vertigo near Elk Mountain, that we all went up to the top of Mount Scott. My border collie was about a year old then, and I got him out on his leash, and we started walking around the mountain. We hopped some boulders and hiked off the summit a bit. At one point, we were on the northeast side of the mountain, and my dog started acting very strange. He tucked his tail and lowered his head like he did when I scolded him. Then he crouched. He wasn't quite lying down, but was nearly so. He seemed to be staring at a pile of boulders. "What's wrong, buddy?" He clearly heard me talking and recognized his name because his head moved my direction for a split second, then he went back to staring. Then he growled, very low, and more like a frightened growl than an angry one. I tugged on the leash to pull him back, assuming there was a snake in the rocks. He got up and darted behind me, tangling me in the leash. Then he went back to his low posture and growled again. A friend of mine noticed the behavior and started petting him. He got in front of the dog, but the dog moved to the side to keep an eye on the same rocks. Finally, I tugged him over to the side to walk away from the area, and he continued to act very strange. He didn't want to walk, kept laying down, and at one point started urinating while he lay down. When he would walk, he was limping like he had sandburrs in between the pads of his paws. We managed to get him about 20 yards away from the boulders, and he suddenly turned back into his normal personality. He stood up, his mouth open, tongue wagged out. He looked around like normal and walked in front of me, tugging me along with a leash as if nothing had happened. At the time, we shrugged it off, and I didn't think much about it. Then after we got back to our camp, I remembered back to my experience on the rock tower near Elk Mountain. Maybe my dog just smelled a snake and wasn't sure what to do about it, but maybe he sensed something more supernatural. I'll never know, but as I talk to people regarding these types of issues, it seems some locations are centers for the unexplainable. A Deerman, or a Skinwalker. A few years after my apparent Deerman encounter, we started camping on a smaller place across the road. For many years, I either slept in a tent or in my pickup. I rarely arrived on these campouts early, so I was always with my group of friends. One year I decided to start hammock camping, and I bought a Fox Outfitters double hammock, a camp tarp, made up a pre-rigged ridgeline, thanks to Corporal's Corner on YouTube, got a sleeping pad and camp quilt, and a Kelty sleeping bag, extra long. I was excited to try it all out, and our next trip was late October. We had 2 campsites on that property, but one was toward the lower point on it and back up in the woods next to a small clearing. For some reason, we really liked having to drive through small gaps in trees to camp next to these small clearings. I don't know. This site was very near the property line, so you could see a 5-strand barbed wire fence from our campfire. I set my hammock up away from camp, back up in the trees and very near the fence. On the other side of the fence is mostly open, but with some old oak trees here and there, and some clumps of smaller oak and cedar about 15 yards beyond the fence. There's an old deer stand in one of the larger trees just on the other side of the fence, but we've never seen anyone in it, even during deer season. The first weekend I was able to try my hammock setup was perfect in every way. The days weren't too warm, and the nights weren't too cold. We could light a big fire to stay warm while we talked and ate and drank, mostly hard apple cider and caramel whiskey, and if it is a little cold at night, it seems to help me sleep once I'm down in my bag. The sky was clear, and the moon was waxing full. I drank enough to get a slight buzz going, but none of us ever drank enough to get staggering. We started moving off to our various sleeping arrangements a little after midnight, and I noticed the beauty and contrast of the woods as I approached my hammock. The bright moon lit the forest floor and the open areas, while the stark shadows of the trees produced bars of near black across the ground. It was quiet. A breeze blew, but barely. I ducked under my tarp and sat on the hammock, then swung one leg up to remove my shoe, then the other. I put my shoes in my backpack, then I removed my phone, keys, CRKT knife, and glasses and put them in as well. It takes a bit for me to shimmy into my bag when I'm in a hammock, but I got the job done, arranged the quilt over me the best I could, and wadded up a shamag that I use as a crude pillow that is also good for covering my face if it gets too cold or if mosquitoes harass me. I fell asleep fast and woke up sometime later, needing to urinate. It wasn't bad, I could hold it, but it woke me up. As I lay there contemplating if I wanted to get up or not, knowing that if I didn't, I'd not be able to fall back asleep very easily, but not really wanting to bother, I looked out the foot end of my tarp, which was toward the fence and the open area beyond. It was bright with moonlight and strikingly beautiful. I decided to go to the bathroom and sat up and started to swing my legs over the edge of the hammock. There was a snort out in the field, and I looked back. I saw nothing at first. Then, a hint of movement in the shadow of one of the larger trees. Branches and tall grass were all I could make out. There was some rustling, and my eyes saw something moving slowly from the shadows. A shape moved partially out into the moonlight, and once again, I saw a set of antlers and a head much like a deer, but it was very low to the ground, and my mind went back to the other time. What was this creature that seemed to always have an interest in me? Did my friends ever see it? Were they also afraid to mention it for fear of sounding crazy? It crept closer, and I could see long limbs bent at odd angles as it came forward on all fours. The back knees were bent out to the sides in an extreme way. It crawled, or walked, up behind a tall clump of Indian grass and stopped. I heard sniffing, then nothing. For several minutes all was quiet and still, except I could see the antlers bobbing around behind the grass ever so slightly. Then suddenly, the long back legs began to straighten, and the creature stood up to its full towering height. It continued to look at me. Its head moved back and forth, and I caught a glint of orange-red in one eye as the moonlight hit it just right. I slowly fished in a pouch in my hammock for my flashlight, found it, and pulled it out. As my arm moved to point it, the creature grunted and darted away from me into one of the clumps of trees with extreme speed. I heard it crashing through the trees, and it was gone. I didn't sleep again that night, but later I heard coyotes yapping to our south. A moment later, a long, low murmur began to join them from southwest of my position. It raised and pitched to a shrill shriek. The coyote stopped abruptly. The shriek continued for 20 seconds or so, and all was silent till the sun came up. Those are the two experiences I've had with what some call the Deerman. I have heard others speak of the Deer Woman, and still others refer to it as a Skinwalker. I have never recounted these stories to anyone, but recently read of an encounter with a similar creature near Mount Scott, and have decided to tell the story here. I have no clue what I encountered those 2 times. I am certain, however, that I have encountered something more than just a deer. Lake Jed Johnson Ghost. There are a number of stories from Lake Jed Johnson, and while I have never personally been there after dark, I know several people who have. This is an experience 2 of my friends related to me about a visit they had to Lake Jed Johnson. When they were still in school, their family had gone into the refuge for a picnic and afternoon sightseeing. They had visited the Holy City and done some short hikes, then went to Mears Country Store for an early dinner. They had driven 2 vehicles, and their parents decided to go home with their daughter while the 2 boys wanted to drive to Lake Jed Johnson to hike a bit before nightfall. There is a dam at the south end of the lake accessible from a parking area, and there is also a tower toward the north end of the lake accessible from a short trail which leads off from a different parking lot. They decided to go to the tower first since it involved hiking a trail and the sun was beginning to go down. We set out from the parking lot, and even though the trail isn't too long, we kind of cut along the shore of the lake, trying to save time. Unfortunately, there were some greenbriers and gnarly trees and stuff, so it may have taken longer. We did finally make it to the tower and climbed up it. The tower has since been sealed off so visitors cannot go inside. Many say this is thanks to the numerous attempts at suicide from the tower, but it is more than likely because of vandalism and the need for constant keep-up as well as safety considerations. People are, as a rule, dumb. They'll hurt themselves, making poor decisions, and they care not for anything that isn't their own property. And since the tower is off by itself, people can do any number of stupid things without attempting suicide. Now, back to the account from my friend's perspective. From the top, we watched the sun going down. My brother said something about going to the dam before the sun went down, and I remember feeling like I replied to him, but I didn't. He was looking at me with a really puzzled look on his face, and it dawned on me I didn't say yes or no. Then we both noticed it was perfectly quiet. I nodded my head up and down, and we turned to go down the stairs when we heard someone coming up them from inside the tower. It shocked us a bit because we had not seen anyone hiking the trail or lollygagging around the tower when we came up. The footsteps seemed to come up part of the way and then stopped. I was getting annoyed waiting on them, so I started down and peeked through the opening in the top of the tower, and nothing was there. I looked at my brother and he shrugged. We both started down a bit faster than we would normally go down steps like that, and about a quarter of the way down I got suddenly cold and some dust flew off the wall. I only noticed the dust because it hit me in the face and some of it got in my mouth. We all but ran the rest of the way down the stairs and back to the pickup, along the trail the entire way. They drove the pickup over to the parking lot by the dam even though the sun was nearly down. Both of them had a chance to catch their breath, but they still had not discussed what happened. We walked down the steps and out onto the dam and just leaned on the side looking over the lake. We could see the tower across the water and it looked normal. Just as the sun went fully down, a soft glow lit up from inside the tower. It wasn't bright, but just enough that we could see some yellowish-green light coming out of the various openings in the tower. It seemed to be moving slowly up the tower until it was on top. I never saw a light source, though. It wasn't like a ball of light was on top of the tower or anything. It just seemed like the glow came from up there. Then there was a harsh scream from the tower. The light went out, and there was a large splash just below us at the base of the dam. That all happened at exactly the same time. I looked down and saw the water was, in fact, disturbed. There were waves going out from where something hit the water. We ran up the steps, got in the pickup, and drove home. Neither of us have any idea what all that meant or what it was. We've been back to Lake Jed Johnson, but only in the daytime. Parallel Forest. There are a great many stories about the parallel forest, and most of them make me laugh. When I first found stories on the internet about the place, I was humored by the fact that many people thought or claimed the forest was the result of some kind of magic or supernatural force. There's also a lot of confusion about why the government planted the trees in the first place. However, if you look at a satellite photo or visit the place in person, you'll see what makes it unique. There are trees planted in rows. The trees are cedars, which I can't imagine why you would want to actually plant those, as they tend to cause erosion and crowd out other trees. Regardless, the parallel forest is a bunch of trees planted in a uniform grid with tons of trails winding around through them. I've been by this forest a number of times in the past, but my first visit was in 2020 while camping near there. I wanted to check out the rumors. I went with a friend of mine and my dog, a very energetic border collie. We started walking through the forest and were having fun just walking. There were a lot of people around. We found some rings of stone in a few places. I guess a lot of folks believe those are where occult rituals take place at night. We walked around for a couple of hours and wound up toward the back of the plot, and it began to get dark. By this point, we did not see anyone else through the gaps in the trees or on the trails, but we could not see too far. My friend turned to lead the way back, and my dog started growling. I looked down, and he was in the usual aggressive stance with his body low, ears turned forward, tail low, hair standing up. He was looking behind me toward the east. A granite mountain slope rises that direction, and the lower end is covered in trees and grass. I looked back toward my friend, who had stopped and turned around. He's a very outdoorsy guy and seems unafraid of anything. "There," he said quietly and slowly pointed. I tried to follow his finger, but that's always difficult. I saw nothing. Left of that tallest cedar tree, about 20 yards, to the right of the big boulder. My eyes followed his direction, and I saw it, a dark shape by the trunk of an oak tree. We could not tell what it was, but it just sat there looking at us. To my eye, it appeared to be a human in dark clothing crouched next to the tree. My dog kept growling, but we backed down the trail, pulling him backwards as well. Once we got into the woods, we started to walk back towards the parking lot. I heard voices. They were not loud, so I assumed there was another party walking the trails still. However, I could not tell which direction the voices were coming from. We were walking and had no intention of stopping, thanks to the strange figure we saw, so it was hard for us to hear. But as we walked, the voices got louder, though no easier to pick out. It became clear that it was chanting, and it didn't sound like English. It continued to get louder. We finally stepped out of the trees on the west side of the forest, and the chanting stopped. There were no other cars in the lot. We got the dog in the back seat of my Outback, loaded up in the front, and I backed out of my spot. I put it into first gear and started to drive toward the gate when my friend said, "Go, go, go!" He likes to mess around, so I assumed it was a joke. I just looked at him. He was looking back through one of the back windows on my side of the car and had a look of genuine terror. I sped up, the tires spun a little, but thank you all-wheel drive, and I shifted into second as we blew through the stop sign and out onto the Mears Road. I looked over my shoulder as I hit third, but didn't see anything. "What was that?" I asked. "I have no idea. Something was chasing us." He said it was all black and bipedal and running very fast from the edge of the forest. That's all he could tell me. We've never been back to the parallel forest, and I have no plans to ever visit again. Green Country. Green Country is the northeastern corner of Oklahoma that leads into the Ozarks. It is hilly and usually tree-covered. It is home to Tulsa, which was once considered, and may still be, the oil capital of the world. There are some other decent-sized cities, quite a bit of unique history, and many interesting places to see. Most non-Green Country Oklahomans tend to avoid Tulsa and prefer to frequent the other parts of the state, and my family was no exception. We live closer to OKC, and for vacations we tended to go either toward the Panhandle or toward the southeastern part of the state. Several of my friends grew up around the Tulsa area, so after meeting them in college we started camping on a couple of places up around that area and frequenting Tulsa more and more often. I began to learn about some of the interesting and unexplainable things up there, such as the spook lights, haunted houses in Tulsa, the center of the universe, and potential hauntings around the towns in the Tar Creek Superfund site. I still don't know much about that area, but it is a fascinating part of our state. From the stories I've heard and the accounts I've gathered for this work, it is clear that quite a bit has gone on in Green Country that is yet to be explained. The Running Slender Man. In the interest of not frustrating the reader, I'll spoil this story from the start. It winds up being funny and explainable. However, it was relayed to me by a friend, and I thought it was too good to not share. My shepherd was barking one night, so I grabbed my G19, Glock 19, and went out the front door as quietly as I could. I stepped around the side of the house and looked in the dark and couldn't see much, but I heard some noise over across the fence. I hit that stream light, a very bright weapon mount light, over the direction it was and saw this weird face. It was long and white. It looked like a skull, and it had two glowing green eyes. The head was over 6 feet off the ground, and it was just looking at me. I couldn't see the body very well because it was dark, but it had very long and skinny legs. I didn't want to shoot it because I didn't know what it was, but I was tripping. It just sat there looking at me for a minute. I took a step closer, then it just took off running down the fence. Its legs were all messed up like the knees were backwards. None of it looked right. It was creepy. I kept the light on it and walked forward as it ran. Finally, it got to the corner of that pasture and turned back toward me a bit. It snorted, and I realized what it was. It was my neighbor's horse. For some reason, my brain wasn't registering the back half until it snorted. A haunted well. A friend of mine was part of a private religious school when he was growing up. Not a large, fancy school. It was almost like a small cult. I don't think it was an actual cult, but from the outside looking in, that's how it seemed. They collectively owned a large piece of land, something less than a full square mile, but easily 300 acres, just outside of Sand Springs. Technically, it was probably within city limits. I remember it being just a few minutes from Brahms and the QT, but once you got out by it, the road was gravel at that time, and it felt like you were in the boondocks. We camped there frequently for a while, and it was a weird place. Most of it was covered in trees, and there was a wide range of elevations. There were ravines cut all over it. In one place we found what looked like an old glass dump. Thousands of bottles had been smashed in a pile, and trees had grown all around it. There was an old semi-trailer parked on a hill, again surrounded by trees. On the east side there was a small cliff, and my friend showed us the path down and how to get over to where they had tied up a rope swing. We would swing out over the deep rocky creek for hours on end. On one of our early trips, he showed us an old well on the west part of the property. He didn't know when it was dug, but it was an old kind that was just a pit with water at the bottom. At some point they had covered it with a bunch of boards, nailed together, but there was no pump in it. We joked about how it would be a good place to hide a body. It is in the middle of the woods on this old property hardly anyone ever goes to, and there was so much grass and underbrush directly surrounding the well that a person would have to stumble on it by luck to find it. If the boards weren't covered up, animals would certainly fall into it at least. The night he showed us the well, we camped nearby. He had an old tarp that he threw on the ground, and we lay our sleeping bags down and got in them. We didn't have a fire that night because we got there late. For a couple of hours, we sat up talking and looking at stars. The glow from Tulsa was fairly bright because we were very close, and from parts of the property you can see the Tulsa skyline, so we couldn't see many stars. It was getting close to midnight when everything got very still, and my friend commented about getting cold. I noticed I was too, and we all looked around. The air was silent. Then there was a crash in the trees over past where the well was located. We heard whimpering. Then there was a loud bang and a splash. Finally, silence. It took us several minutes, but we got the nerve to go look back in the well. When we shined a light down in it, we could see nothing except some swirling fog or steam coming off the water. It was just at the bottom and very light. There was nothing in the water. There were no ripples, there was no sound. We all felt extremely cold. We looked around the area, but there was no trampled grass except where we had walked, and no sign of anything out of the ordinary. And then there was a gunshot. We dropped the board cover back on the well, and all of us crouched in the grass and looked toward where the sound came from. The gunshot wasn't extremely close, but sounded to be on the property or maybe adjacent to the property. Of course, with where this property is located, it's not uncommon to hear gunshots. A place I worked nearby later in life had 2 occasions where pistol caliber bullets came through the ceiling, so it's frequent that someone is shooting around there. We all went back and got in our sleeping bags. All of us were armed, and there was a lot of tall grass and young trees around us, so unless someone came across the trail we made through the grass, we'd be okay. At least safe from people. We camped on that property several more times over the next few years, but we never went to the side that had the well except in daytime. And we never heard or saw anything strange there again, though I always felt odd on that place. A patrol on Lake Fort Gibson. Some friends and I used to camp at Lake Fort Gibson. not at a campsite or any kind of actual camping area, but down a trail on one side of the lake that only locals would go down. To get to the trail, one would have to drive through a community of very dilapidated houses. These houses were mostly lived in, except for the one trailer house that had been the scene of an actual murder and was rotting away in a field of unkempt grass and trees. Once a person makes it to the trail, there will likely be giant mud pits and downed trees to navigate. At the end of the trail is an open area that was once home to a giant dead tree trunk that had fallen over. Locals dumped junk there. We camped there and often attempt to clean up the junk or at least burn what we could. The reason we camped there is because we could shoot guns and nobody cared. Or at least nobody was brave enough to confront us about it. One of the times we were camping at Lake Fort Gibson, we had a large bonfire going in the opening near the water. We had a sofa that we'd burned, and at one point we put a sheet of plywood on the fire and took turns jumping through the flames. We weren't drinking, I promise. As usual, we were also shooting guns. It's really not a good idea to shoot at night, but thanks to the massive downed tree trunk and the steep rocky side of the promontory we were camping on, we could put targets up and shoot with a high degree of safety. One of my friends noticed a police boat or some other kind of official-looking boat across the lake along the other shore. It had a red and blue strobe going and was running a spotlight along the shore. It was a bit unsettling. The primary assumptions we could make were that either someone was missing and they were looking for a dead body, or someone was trying to go missing and they were looking for a live body. Either case was unsettling to us. As stated before, this is a fairly wild section of lakeshore that felt extremely remote despite its proximity to civilization. More boats appeared as time went on and they started combing our shoreline. Assuming they would come over and talk to us, we unloaded all the guns and put them away. The purpose was not to hide the guns or pretend we weren't shooting, but it's just a good idea to make your area safe and as non-threatening as possible if law enforcement is likely to visit. It makes things go so much smoother. Despite some of the boats patrolling our direction, none of them ever stopped by. They would stop patrolling as they neared us and would go out toward the middle of the lake to go around. It was strange. We started getting upset because we wanted to know what they were looking for so we could be on alert if that were warranted. Briefly, we discussed packing up and going back to Tulsa, but we were all well-heeled as well as young and cocky, so we stayed put. Our sleeping area was in our normal spot up the slope on the flat-ish top of the promontory, so we eventually kicked the fire out and went up to go to sleep. Within a few minutes, my friend's 1979 Ford Bronco alarm started going off. Grabbing our guns, we all headed downhill as fast as we could until we got right behind the big tree trunk. He had shut the alarm off with the remote. We sat there for a few moments and saw nothing, so we got out and looked around. I checked my 1990 Chevy 1500 WT, though I doubt anyone would want to mess with it. I didn't have an alarm. We saw nothing out of the ordinary. As soon as we got back into our sleeping bags, the Bronco alarm chirped. We sat up. The alarm didn't go off, it just chirped. After a few minutes, we lay back down. The alarm went off again. Down the hill we went, and once again, nothing was there. We all started giving the one friend a hard time about his alarm being broken and complaining about how it was keeping us awake. When we got back up to our camping spot, all of our sleeping bags were tossed off the tarp in all different directions. Guns and flashlights were instantly pointed, also in all different directions. None of us could see anything or any sign of intrusion other than the fact our bags were tossed around. As we started to pick them up, the truck alarm went off again. Frightened and exasperated, we all grabbed our gear and took it back down the hill. We didn't leave, but we all climbed in the vehicles. There were 4 of us, 2 to a truck. We should have left. Each of us shimmied into our bags the best we could and tried to sleep. I would just about fall asleep, and I'd feel a bump against my pickup. It would rock slightly. Nothing big, but enough to make the tassel from my high school graduation that was hanging from my rearview mirror sway back and forth a little, enough that I could feel it. I would look out my window and in the side mirror, but I could never see anything. Then I'd settle down and almost fall asleep, and it would happen again. After the 4th or 5th time, I whispered, "Do you feel that?" "Uh-huh," my friend said. The Bronco was in front of me, and I saw it rock slightly. My friend's face could be seen lit up by the moon in the mirror looking back at me. He had a cigarette lit up, and I saw him nod his head. His brake lights came on as he pressed the brake, and the Bronco shook as he turned it over. I put my pickup in neutral and held the brake while I turned the key. It cranked, but neither vehicle would start. Both of us kept turning them over, pumping the gas pedal slightly, turning the key off, and starting again. Nothing was working. Finally, my pickup fired up. I heard his start at nearly the same time because his exhaust was loud. Something hammered the bed of my pickup with a loud bang. It felt like a heavy weight was dropped in the bed. I didn't look back, but honked at my friend who needed to turn in front of me so he'd be out of my way. Otherwise, I'd have to back down a mile of rough road. He cut his wheel and punched it, which threw dirt all over my windshield. His Bronco was quite lifted. It was hard for me to see his vehicle, but I saw his headlights dart past my passenger side window, so I cut the wheel and dumped the clutch. The back end spun around. I over-rotated a bit, but corrected and kept the throttle down, and we fishtailed a bit down the road following the Bronco. "Go, go, go," my other friend said. "I'm going," I replied. We bounced down the road. Some of the dirt on my windshield was falling off. My wipers weren't helping much, but they did knock some off. I could see the taillights of the Bronco, and I just followed them. Then I heard a tapping on my back glass. I couldn't look, but my friend did. He says he never saw anything. The tapping consisted of about 4 taps in quick succession, then a pause of about 30 seconds, then 4 more taps. It continued till we got to a point where the road turned and started climbing up the hill. We drove back to Tulsa and slept on the floor of my friend's living room. Believe it or not, that was not the last time we camped near that spot at the lake. That is the end of this story, but I have to tell another funny thing that isn't even related to the mysterious. Unless you count seeing a big dude run backwards down a mountain with a boulder crashing into his shins and knees without falling down as mysterious. There was another time in nearly the same spot that we were camping, and of course we were running around at night with guns and lights looking for small woodland creatures to terrorize. We had walked along the shore of the lake where we parked our cars and then turned and started hiking up the steep and rocky slope that was the very tip of that promontory. Several of us used a big, flat rock to hoist ourselves up, and the last friend in line, who we'll call Dan, stepped up on it. Dan is a big, strong dude. That big, flat rock tipped right out of the ground as he put his weight on it and started flopping down the slope. Dan was running backwards, somehow not tripping on vines and sticks and other rocks, also somehow not getting tripped by the big rock, which was banging into his legs on every turn, and simultaneously holding the rifle he was carrying up in the air. It was another friend's, and Dan was trying not to scratch it. It did get a little scuffed. To this day we have no idea how, but Dan didn't get crushed, and he stayed on his feet all the way to the bottom, or at least near enough that the rock stopped. Another friend, Omar, and I tried to flip the rock, and we couldn't. I'm not especially strong, but Omar was. The rock was huge and heavy, but then Dan has always had good balance. He inadvertently skated across the parking lot of ice once too, and at least 3 times his center of mass was so far off, I knew he was going down, but he never did. Now that's unexplainable. A cold night in a cave. One of the last times we camped at that location, we were dumb enough to sleep in exactly the same place as the time the car alarms were going off. We still had no tents and were still sleeping out in the open. This trip was our annual first week of December campout, which was typically our last trip of the year, and we would not go again till the break for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We had a new guy along for the trip too, and he was not very experienced and even more ill-prepared than the rest of us. I was still sporting my down mummy bag inside the quilt bag setup so I could sleep in pretty cold weather. This guy brought a sheet. That's it. He didn't even have a heavy coat. In the daytime, the temperature wasn't too cold, but that first night it dropped pretty low. I was fully clothed with multiple layers, including insulated coveralls, and was inside both my bags, and I was still a little chilly. I wasn't sure he was going to make it, and I was selfish enough at that time that I didn't care. I had my SKS inside my bag with me to keep frost off it. A couple hours after we fell asleep, I heard a crashing in the woods. It was loud, it was close, and it was coming closer. I swam out of my double bags and came up in a sitting position with my SKS at high ready. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Dan was up with a gun out as well. Into the ring of firelight we see the new guy, Aaron, dragging the biggest hero log I've ever seen anyone pull to a fire. "Aaron, I almost shot you." "I'm cold." Those of us who had ample sleeping bags tucked back in because it was super cold, and we didn't say anything else as he positioned the log in the fire. It was a bit too big to light up quickly with how low the fire had gotten, but it eventually lit. We didn't have too much more disturbance that first night, but when I woke up, I noticed that the edge of Aaron's sheet he was sleeping under got burned. He was basically laying in the fire. Once the sun was up, the temperature got back to bearable. It wasn't comfortable, but the wind wasn't bad, and the air was dry. We set off to explore a bit away from the lake edge and up on the top of the highland. We had been up there before, playing in the rocks and boulders, but limited to the end of the peninsula. We decided to hike north. It was getting quite boring after a while until my friend, Jesse, noticed a big depression up ahead. As we approached, we all noticed it was a deep sinkhole about 30 feet across and maybe 15 to 20 feet deep. We all walked around it slowly. Jesse said he thought there was a cave in the side at the bottom. I couldn't see anything of the kind, but he insisted. He wanted to go check it out, but I did not, yet he talked me into going down and looking while Aaron and Dan stayed up at top. Down we scrambled, and sure enough, there was a small cave opening at the bottom. It was small enough we had to crawl on all fours to get into it. Again, I didn't want to go, but I did. After a few feet inside, it was big enough we could stand up. From there, the floor of the cave climbed slightly and turned to the right. "We're going to find a dead body, I just know it," he said. "Can we go?" I replied. "Come on, let's see where it leads." I grabbed the back of his shirt and we shuffled along. It was still very narrow as it went around the bend, and down toward our feet there was a shelf where the walls came in, then there was an undercut, so the very bottom of the floor was wider. I was actually worried most about snakes hibernating under that shelf of rock. Around the corner, the floor flattened out and started down again, and the cave got both wider and taller. Jesse had the only flashlight and was shining it around. He pointed it down and saw something. "What is that?" I looked down and saw what looked like a leg bone, cleaned of all muscle but retaining the tendons and ligaments. It looked exactly like that. He reached down and pulled it out from under the shelf of rock, and the other end was very obviously a stick. It was just an odd-looking stick. We saw an empty Mountain Dew bottle and a pillow, which made me less eager to stay there. Clearly, someone else had been in here, and they might come back. Anyone who randomly sleeps in a cave like this probably can't be trusted. The cave turned back to the left and then dead-ended. As far as we could tell, there was nothing else to it. There were no dead bodies, thankfully. We talked about how cool it was, talked about the likelihood that someone would show up who lived there, and discussed if we thought any wild animals would sleep there at night. Then, for some reason, my friend turned off the flashlight. It seemed pitch black at first, but not really, because there was a faint glow on one side of the cave, and we both looked at it as our eyes adjusted to the darkness. Boo. That word was written on the wall in glowing paint. It scared us both in an extreme way, but only briefly. Then we laughed about how great of a joke that was and how someone painted that there, even though it was unlikely anyone would ever see it. "Hey, don't tell the other guys about the paint, okay?" Jesse wanted to try to scare them with it. After that, we climbed back out and up and explained most of what we had found sans the paint. We eventually talked the other two into going down into the cave. It was a bit of a tight fit, but we all got in there, and we made sure to shine the light on the paint to energize the glow. Then, when they were both looking at that wall, Jesse turned the light off. It got them both, but I think we may have given it away a little because they didn't seem as scared or surprised by it. Then Jesse got the bright idea to try to light a fire in the entrance. He thought the smoke would draw up the sinkhole, and we could hang out inside the cave and stay warm. First, it's a bad idea to light a fire in such a place anyway. Very bad. Second, it's not really necessary because the caves are well insulated naturally from the outside temperatures. That's why animals hibernate in them. Third, we almost died. He got the fire lit, and for some reason we were all in the cave. Someone should have been out in the sinkhole to pull sticks out if they needed to. As we all coughed and sputtered, it became clear this wasn't working, so Jesse and I started kicking sticks and trying to throw them out into the sinkhole. That caught a fire out there, and some of that smoke was coming in. By the time we realized the gig was up and we had to crawl through the fire and coals, none of us could see or breathe. We just had to do the best we could and scramble out with our eyes shut and our lungs burning. We did make it out, though. After that, we decided we would sleep in the cave since it was so cold outside, but we would not light a fire in the cave. I know how hypocritical that may sound after my statement about trust, but I think the statement stands. I was not extremely keen on the idea of sleeping in the cave, but the group wanted to. We decided to move all our stuff up there, which was an ordeal. That meant getting all our stuff from the other camp, loading it into our cars, driving back up the road a half-mile, carrying all our stuff up through the woods and climbing a natural rock stair to get atop a small cliff, climbing down into the sinkhole, dragging our stuff through the cave opening, and setting it up inside. After doing that, we decided that we did not want all our guns inside the cave because any shots that go off are more dangerous for us than whatever we would be shooting at. I was worried about something or someone coming down in the cave, so we also decided we would draw straws to see who gets to sleep in the cave entrance, and that person would get a pistol to sleep with just in case. I drew the short straw, probably because Jesse manipulated the drawing. The worst part was the cave floor was not level where I had to sleep, so I had a rock in my back most of the night. Another issue was that Aaron slept very heavily and was extremely noisy. He snored, groaned, moaned, and breathed heavily all night long. And we had a bat in the cave with us for a while, but Jesse was offended by it and threw things at it until it flew away. I imagine it died, and in that region there are no dangerous bats, so I was a bit upset about it. Late in the night, I awoke to the sound I had feared the most, leaves rustling outside the cave. Something large was moving around the top of the sinkhole. I pulled the pistol and got my light ready just in case. At first, I just assumed it was an armadillo or possum or some other small creature, but it was pacing back and forth repeatedly. Then it started to slowly come down into the sinkhole. When I thought it was in the entrance, I hit it with the light. I saw what appeared to be a humanoid head, but not quite human. It had large eyes, but they were dark with a tinge of red. It was down on all fours, which it would have to be to peer into the cave. Now I was really frightened because I assumed it was whoever left the Mountain Dew bottle and the pillow, and they were probably wanting to come in for a nap. He was probably pissed off that someone was hitting him in the face with a beam of light from inside his own house. But then it growled at me and said something in a language I have never heard before, low and guttural. My hands were shaking, so the light and the pistol were rattling around. "Dan," I whispered. Dan was sleeping closest to me. He didn't wake up. "Dan," I said out loud. I looked back toward Dan to see if he was moving, but he wasn't, and in that instant I heard scrambling rocks. Assuming the thing was coming in the cave, I looked back, but it was gone. Then I heard the leaves and sticks and rocks tumbling down the sinkhole, followed by leaves crunching at the top. It had left the cave, but it stayed near the top of the sinkhole. I heard it walking around and talking in that voice. The voice wasn't loud, and I couldn't hear anything but quiet murmuring. Every once in a while there would be a growl. Shutting the light off, I lay there with the gun pointed at the cave entrance. I could not sleep at all and continued listening to the thing stalk around outside. Apparently, I did fall asleep hours later because I awoke to gray light coming in the cave entrance. It was dawn. The pistol was in my right hand and the flashlight in my left. I looked around and everyone else was still asleep. Sitting up, I looked as far up in the cave as I could. Then I got out of my bag and rolled it up. I sat there till Dan woke up and told him that something tried to come in the cave. He didn't really believe me at first, but eventually he decided I had seen some kind of animal, and my mind made up the rest. He and I crawled out of the cave and climbed up to the top so we could start taking our camping supplies back down to the cars. He was the first to notice the scratches on the tree trunks. They were 5 to 6 feet high and looked like bear scratches. And then on one tree, we found scratched the words, "Go away." A year later, we went back to the sinkhole cave in the daytime and showed some other people, but we never went there at night. After a few more years, we started camping in other locations that were easier to get to and less weird. I have not been back in 15 years at this point. Prairie Dogmen. I used to work at a job that required me to regularly meet with landowners in the north central section of the state, often going up into Osage and Kay counties near the Kansas border. One of my clients owned a huge amount of land that actually extended into Kansas in what is known as the Flint Hills. His property covered an old town that is essentially a ghost town, complete with an old railroad station and rail bridge. Sometimes they'll list that town on the weather reports on the news, and we laugh because nobody has lived there for decades upon decades. He uses some of the old buildings to store supplies in so he can stop on his way to check cattle. The land is rolling grassland with few trees, and with how the land rises and falls, there is a mesa-like hill on his property where you can look 3 different directions and see the water towers and grain elevators from 3 different towns, and all of them are over 10 miles away. Those are the closest towns to him, consequently. Early in our business relationship, we only talked about the money, the work, the cattle, the markets, the grain, the economy, and the oil. The inputs and the outputs were all we cared about. As we grew to know each other better, he started realizing that I genuinely cared about his family and his operation, and I started realizing that he really knew what he was doing and that he had a lot he could teach me. We became friends. After a couple of years, we started having long conversations about our various experiences during our meetings. I'd been asking him about ranching over the years and how it had changed. He was much older than me and had a lot to share. Over time, we got deeper and deeper into his personal experiences. One day, he surprised me with an abrupt turn in the trend of our conversation. At first, I thought he was speaking in hyperbolic terms about how ranching works sometimes, or about what people would do to make ends meet. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. Yeah, I imagine that is true. You've kept this ranch going through oil booms, busts, the savings and loan crashes, all of it. Nah, I'm not talking about that stuff. He paused a moment, looking off toward the western horizon. Things you really wouldn't believe. Now his head turned toward me, and he was piercing me with his eyes. It was like he was testing me to see if I would crack, or if he could trust me enough to tell me what was on his mind. Try me, I said. Back to looking at the sky, he said, this land has history going back before the settlers, before the Indians, before the Spanish who came through this region at times, before the people who had it before the Indians. History doesn't record the first people here, but they still have influence. I was intrigued. I opened a cooler and handed him a water, then grabbed one for myself. He nodded, and I sat up on the tailgate of his pickup that we had driven out to look at that part of his range. I was 26 when my daddy died and left this place to me. I'd worked it most of my life. Somehow, I missed having to go to war like so many did, which was good because he had to have some help in the years before he passed. I was married then, so we moved into the main house, kept raising cattle and horses and dogs and chickens, and started raising kids. It was a lot to keep up with, but at the time we couldn't afford much help. Most days I was 5 miles out in the field before the horizon started to change color, and I'd not see my wife before the night was black again. She took care of all the chores up by the house and all the kids, God bless her. Kept me fed too and tried to keep our accounts straight. For the first few years things was good enough to get by, but then we hit a hard winter and there wasn't no precipitation for 8 months. We come out of that winter dry as a bone, and it didn't rain till a thunderstorm came through in July. We had to push cattle to market, and they were lean and the market down because nobody had any grass to put them on. Boys from up north were buying them up cheap, feeding them out, and then making a killing on them at market. We were hurting, and it didn't help my marriage none. I spent more time away from home trying to work to get right. My wife and I would fight most times we were together unless one of us was asleep, which was more often than not. One night I rode my best horse out to a ridge over west of here and just sat watching the sun go down. I didn't know what to do. I confess I teared up. That's how hard things were and how lost I was. Just as the sun went down, I saw a man on the next ridge, and he was looking at me. He stood there just looking. But he looked strange. I couldn't tell much in the fading light, but he didn't look to be fully dressed. Well, I knew this was my land, and he looked to be squatting on it. I rode my horse down the hill, through the draw, and back up the next side. My horse started shying as we got up to the top and wouldn't go on, so I got off and scurried up the rest of the way. When I got to the top, he wasn't there. I looked around and didn't see him anywhere atop that hill, so I turned to go back and get my horse and noticed the person on the hill I had just left. I couldn't tell if it was the same or not, but it left me feeling odd. I shouted, "You're trespassing! Who are you?" But the figure just stood there. I got to worrying about someone coming up behind me. I hadn't passed anyone going through the draw, and as far as I could tell, there was 2 or more people out there. I always carry a lever gun and a scabbard on my horse, so I got in the saddle and shucked it and started back across. I took a different route that went further east up around that draw so I could keep an eye on him. He just watched me as I rode around. We started getting close to my old pony shied again. He didn't do that much normally, and it made me madder. I spurred him pretty good, but he wouldn't go. I got down and walked on, but when I was maybe 20 yards out, I just hit a wall. There was nothing in front of me, I just couldn't go on. My legs wouldn't work. That's when I heard words. They weren't English. The person was chanting something in a low, deep voice. From time to time, the voice would get higher just for a brief second or two. I couldn't move ahead or behind, so I just watched. The light was getting pretty dim by then, and suddenly he vanished, just into thin air. I could move then, so I did, and walked up to where he had been. Would you believe there was a bag laying where he had been standing? I picked it up, and it was heavy. I couldn't see well what was in it, so I just climbed back on my horse and went home. It took me some time to get back, but I opened that sack in the tack room of the barn, and it was a bunch of little gold nuggets. It didn't wind up amounting to much, but it saved the ranch. It kept us afloat for another 6 months. Huh, I said. I told you you wouldn't believe me, but it happened more than once. The next year I saw him in the same place and there was more gold. Then another year later I saw him. I also started seeing odd lights from one ridge to the next at dusk and sometimes in the middle of the night. Then one evening, with the sun just down and the western sky orange and pink, I saw a bunch of dogmen. Dogmen? I said with a sarcastic tone in my voice. I guess that's what you'd call them. Coyotes, but running on man legs. Tall, brown, and gray, naked but for some loincloths, running full out through the grass. There were about a dozen of them, about 100 yards away. I watched them run up over a hill, and as they went over, the last one turned and looked at me, and he looked just like the man I'd seen leaving gold. You're not serious. I am. It happened. I stopped getting gold after a while, and things turned around. The ranch was doing fine, and my wife and I were getting along. The kids were growing. Eventually, they moved off. From time to time, I see the dogman, but from a distance. I don't see the man alone anymore. What are they? I don't really know. I've heard of dog soldiers before. I don't know exactly what they are, and I've only ever told my wife before. I've studied all this land for the past 60 years, and there are no other houses, huts, dwellings, or shelters around that I don't know of. There are a few caves on the property, but none too deep, and I've explored them all. I tried to follow the dogmen once, but they went too fast and my horse threw me. Whatever they are, they've never bothered me except to help me, so I leave them alone now. To be honest, I personally think they were spirits of the natives, happy to have a place so large with nobody on it. They somehow know that I keep it that way, and they somehow knew when I was struggling and wanted to keep me from having to sell out. That's all I can think of. My kids, they have no interest in this place. When I join my wife in death, the kid will likely piece it out and take the profit. I'm not sure where the spirits of the dogmen will go after that. We stood in silence for quite some time. I didn't know what to think about it all. I don't believe those kinds of stories, but the man had never lied to me before. Deep down, I believed him. It was just that the story sounded so absurd. Then he started talking again. I've tried to talk to the kids about it, to warn them, I guess. They think I'm crazy. I want them to do what they think is right. I just don't know if the dogmen will be happy when they sell the land off. If people come in and develop it, will the ancestors just leave? Will they try to stop it? I don't know. I don't want anybody to get hurt. My friend died less than a year after that meeting, and I miss him. Choctaw Country. The state of Oklahoma calls the southeastern corner of the state Choctaw Country. That part of the state is home to what is probably considered the most famous and well-known cryptid in America, Sasquatch. The town of Honoiba seems to be the hub of those stories, though they spread out far and wide. Choctaw Country also boasts of an interesting part of our history since it is such a rugged and remote part of what was once Indian territory. It was home to natives and outlaws alike. It is the primary setting for the wonderful and exciting tale of True Grit, where U.S. Marshal Rooster Cogburn and teenage Mattie Ross from near Dardanelle County tracks outlaws to their hideout in the Winding Stair Mountains. If you wish to visit a real outlaw hideout from those days, Robber's Cave is the place to go. There are also alleged Viking runestones in that area. for most people, it is the most beautiful and striking part of our state with mountains, clear rivers, and pine trees. If we could keep the Texans out, it might be a decent place. I'm not really kidding, but if it makes you feel better, I'll pretend I am. The Gravel Highway. When I was younger, my family would travel to Beaver's Bend State Park north of Broken Bow, Oklahoma, every year or so between Christmas and the New Year. I grew fairly familiar with the area, and when I went off to college, I talked my friends into doing an annual camping trip in January to Robbers Cave and Beaver's Bend. One year my little brother was driving and I was navigating. None of us had cell phones at the time, and cell phones of that era didn't have the ability to do anything other than send texts and make calls. I had the official Oklahoma paper map, probably from 1990 or some other seemingly ancient year. The guys all agreed to go a different route than we normally do, so I promised to find a way. The shortest way I found was State Highway 144. I guided my brother to it, and we suddenly found ourselves on a gravel road. This caused us some concern, especially since it was quite narrow with trees hanging over and blocking most of the sky over our heads. Forging ahead, my brother asked if I was sure. I was. I'm a good navigator. I was confused, but sure we were on the road I was looking at on my map. To be honest, though, I wasn't sure we really wanted to be on the road. I continued to act the confident navigator, however. After a few miles, we came to a right angle turn to the left, followed almost immediately by a right angle turn to the right. There was nowhere to turn around, and luckily we weren't meeting oncoming traffic. We eventually went through a few tiny towns, if you could call them towns. The road wound up being nearly 40 miles long. It was a very long drive and took us a bit, but it was the fastest way from where we had been to where we were going. We never met a soul on that road, going or coming. Now, this isn't a frightening story, but it could have been. Nobody knew where we were, and one little thing could have gone wrong, and we'd have been having a rough time of it. It was also just an unnerving road to go down. As far as I know, they've paved that highway now, and the latest paper map I have indicates it is a paved road. I'm happy we were able to say we traveled down a gravel highway, but I'm glad we drove down it in the daytime. Highway 144 Stalker. This account is from another acquaintance of mine who I used to work with. We were talking about camping and odd things that happened to us when I brought up the old gravel highway. He gave me a nervous laugh, and I asked him what that was for. He brushed it off and changed the subject. From time to time I would bother him about it, and eventually he started to sound like he might tell me why the subject of State Highway 144 made him act weird. He was still hesitant though, so I offered to buy him lunch, and he accepted. At lunch I recounted my story of driving down the highway and then asked if he'd been down it. He nodded, waited a few minutes, then made me promise not to repeat anything he was about to say. He told me the story that I'm about to recount, which I have gotten his permission to tell again, assuming I don't divulge any information about him. I grew up in McAllister and went to Eastern Oklahoma College over in Wilburton. I spent a lot of time down in that part of the state. A couple of my friends and I like to mountain bike, and there are a lot of cool places to go. One spring break, we took off to explore some areas, and we wound up on 144. It was still gravel, and we thought it was pretty cool and secluded. We were in his Forester with our bikes on top, and we noticed that some of the tree branches were snagging the bikes. So we stopped and started working at getting them down and trying to fit them in the back of the vehicle. It wasn't like they just wouldn't fit, but we had a bunch of stuff back there, and we were needing to take the wheels and some other things off. We got the first one disassembled, and my friend was fitting pieces around our bags and ice chests when I heard a loud rustling behind me in the trees. I turned and looked, but saw nothing. I looked for about 20 seconds, then turned back around to go to work on the second bike. Both of us kept hearing the rustling from time to time, but it got to the point we were just ignoring it. About the time we got the second bike in the car, a large, broken tree branch came flying out of nowhere and hit the side of the car. It didn't fall, and there weren't any broken branches above us. We both saw it fly from the side. Looking to the side it came from, we couldn't see anything. The brush was thick. Then there was a loud hoot noise, and some low shrubs and branches started shaking wildly. I started noticing a nasty, musky scent as well. We both jumped in the car, and he took off. Of course, we both felt better right away, that is until I saw a large creature running on two legs through the trees to my right. It was keeping up with us. Admittedly, we weren't going that fast. It was a narrow gravel road after all, but the thing was running 30 miles per hour through the trees and brush. It looked at me, but with the blur of the trees going by, I could not tell what it was. I told the driver to go faster, and he asked why he should. I explained that this thing was pacing us. He stole a glance to the side and put the pedal down a bit further. I think we were doing 50 by that time. He wouldn't risk going any faster, and from time to time, we would hit looser gravel and get a little jiggy with it. Neither of us wanted to wipe out, obviously, but he was okay to risk going that fast. The thing started to fall behind a bit, and then we actually heard it screaming behind us. The driver gasped, and I saw him looking in the rearview mirror, so I looked out the back glass and could see the thing standing in the road well behind us. It had its mouth wide open, howling. We drove for a bit longer, and the road wound up going through some open farmland. That was a relief to both of us. But then at one point, we had to drive back through a low forested area. Once again, the trees crowded the road, and as we came around a corner, we saw a ghastly sight. There was a nasty deer carcass hanging from a tree branch over the road. It appeared to have been gutted long ago, and the flesh was hanging off the bones. It was tied up in the tree with a vine. My friend couldn't stop in time, and it smacked into the window. Luckily, he had slowed down, so it just bounced off and slid down the side of the forester. We could smell it, but it didn't do any major damage and didn't leave too much residue behind. We didn't stop, and we never saw any other sign of such creatures. When we made it to Highway 259, we actually turned north and went back home. We didn't mountain bike again for a long while, but we did eventually start back up. I've never seen anything like that again. Ouchita Howler. A friend of mine and I decided to hike the Ouchita National Recreation Trail. We were not going to hike all of it, as it is about 224 miles long, and we did not have time to hike that far. We were in pretty good shape at the time, so we decided to take a long weekend and drive down one day, hang out at Talamina State Park, then hike for 3 days, and end up at Queen Wilhelmina State Park in Arkansas. My friend's girlfriend and another friend of hers were going to camp in Talamina, then pick us up at the lodge, and we would then drive back home in the dark to get up early for a tired day of work the next morning. Our 3 days of hiking would be nearly 52 miles, which is a stretch, but like I said, we were in pretty good shape and had been hiking quite a bit. Things started well. We arrived at Talamina State Park in the middle afternoon, and the weather was fantastic. We did some short hikes there and played a game called Cube. If you haven't heard of it, go look it up. It's a great yard game. Then we set up camp there and had a small dinner and sat around the fire sipping whiskey and talking. My friend and I went to bed early, but the girls stayed up late. We left them before the sun came up. They were still sleeping, but we double-checked our bags and gear and took off down the trail. Or up and down the trail, as it were. There are some interesting things along the trail. It isn't like in the Rocky Mountains, but it is still scenic, and this was in the fall, so the leaves were starting to change. This is the busy time of year for that part of the state, but once you get out on the long part of the trail, it isn't bad. We passed the old military road trail and other trail spurs. We were a bit behind and didn't cross the Bohannon Creek till noon, so we stopped there and ate some freeze-dried fruit but made our lunch fast. There wasn't much water in the creek, but we had plenty, so we moved on. Dead Man's Gap was next, another trail, beautiful views, and then late in the afternoon the Cedar Branch. Luckily there was enough water there for us to make a short stop and filter some into our reservoirs. Then we made the roughly 3-mile final stretch of that day to the Holson Valley Shelter. While we had made up some time through the afternoon, it was still after sundown when we arrived. Another couple of hikers were already there with a fire going, so we set up our bags on the other side of the shelter and joined them. Jerky was exchanged for some hard apple ciders, and we had a grand time chatting. State Highway 1 is just a couple hundred feet from the shelter, and they had talked some friends into bringing up the brews and dropping them off, for which we were grateful. Since we had another long day ahead of us, 2 to be more exact, we only had a single can each, and we bid them good night and went to bed. They talked quietly for a bit, then hit the hay as well. Embarrassingly, we got a late start on Sunday because we slept in. The other hikers were getting up and around, and they were graceful enough to wake us up. They knew we had a long stretch to do. We thanked them and gathered our gear and set off hiking, eating dried fruit as we walked. Hiking this day was more a blur. There are some trail spurs and creek crossings, but we were in a hurry. We stopped briefly every hour or 2, but had no time to take it in. There are some other shelters along the trail as well, and those were quite inviting, but of course we had to keep going. Big Cedar Creek provided water refills at nearly sundown. It was once again late when we walked up to the Pashube shelter, which was our stop. Nobody was there. It was also darker and later, but we lit a fire, not intending on staying up very late. We just wanted a chance to relax for a bit before going to sleep, and quite honestly, we were both super hungry. As we ate our dinner, a dead quiet came over the area. There was no wind, but there were no birds, frogs, crickets, or even mosquitoes. Those things are usually still out in early October in Oklahoma, especially birds and rodents and things like that. Tired as we were, we didn't even realize it at first and just kept talking. That was until my friend heard a grunt. I didn't hear it, but he told me about it. "Deer," I said. He shrugged and said something about it not sounding like a deer grunt, but went back to eating. A few minutes later there was another grunt, and we both heard it. It did not sound like a deer to me either, though I don't consider myself an expert on the subject. We stopped talking and began to wrap up our meal, which caused us to realize how dead quiet it was around us. All we could hear was the crackling of our small fire, and occasionally, a grunt. The grunting was always from the same place, downhill to the east of the shelter where the undergrowth was more substantial. Closer to the shelter and on the other side it was wide open under the pine trees. My friend and I both grabbed our lights and shined them out the direction of the noises. For a brief moment there were two shining spots, eyes reflecting back at us, coming from beside a tree and low in what appeared to be a holly bush. The bush shook and the spots disappeared, followed by the noise of heavy footsteps receding downhill. We both walked out to where it had been, me more reluctantly. Leaves and pine needles were shuffled around, but we could find no obvious tracks and nothing visible further down the hill among the brush and trees. I still assumed the animal was a deer. My friend thought it might be a black bear. Both theories had problems, but both were plausible. The more I thought about it, the more I agreed with him, which was disconcerting, but not terribly so. We decided to rig a bear bag with paracord, and we both stripped out of our sweaty clothes and put them and the food up a tree. Then we went to bed, promising each other to not sleep so late the next morning. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of something smacking the back wall of the shelter. The shelter had 3 walls. The 2 on the sides were partial walls, and the back was solid. My friend shot up about the time I did, and a second loud thump shook the shelter. We both scrambled to get out of our bags, get our shoes on, and grab our lights. Another thump. Shouting, we switched on the lights and ran out the shelter and straight away from it. We turned and shined our lights back at it, then started around it on the uphill side. There was one more thump, and then some growling and grunting, and those heavy footsteps again, headed off into the woods. The bear bag was gone, completely, with no sign except the hole in the ground the stake had been in. There were scratches on the tree like a bear had been there. Looking behind the shelter, we found some overturned rocks and some places where something had walked or kicked around in the pine needles. Suddenly a large rock landed near my friend and bounced up against the shelter. Then another one smacked the roof. Then came ape-like hooting from somewhere out in the forest. We started to run back to the inside of the shelter as more rocks landed. As I went around the corner, I shined my light back and saw a large, hairy, bipedal creature in the act of hurling a rock. It was gray or brown, dark, and tall. I'm certain it was the famed Sasquatch. We hastily packed our sleeping bags and remaining things and took off away from the creature, but keeping the trail on our left. After a moment, I think we had only made 100 yards or so, the thing started howling behind us. Not like a wolf, like a primate. It did not sound like it was following us. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. Flashlights blazing, we continued down the trail till dawn. Then as the sun came up, we took a break on the east bank of the Kiamichi River. There had been several crossings already, but we hit those before the sun came up. We had no food to eat, but we had water, and we drank our fill, then filtered more and set off. Neither of us was in a mood to look around. The wonderful vistas and views are a blur. The other spur trails and crossings have no place in my memory. I do not remember crossing into Arkansas. Vaguely, I can recollect meeting some people on the trail. We warned them, but awkwardly and without details, because we didn't want to seem crazy, but we also didn't want to just let people walk into danger. Black bear was the excuse we finally used and just told them to look out. Lunchtime found us walking up the last bit of trail to the Queen Wilhelmina Lodge. Since we were early, we went into the diner and grabbed some burgers. We were starving. Without talking to each other, it became clear that neither of us was eager to go outside, and so we did not. For several hours, we just sat and dozed, startling ourselves awake repeatedly, looking at each other for confirmation that it was okay, and waited for his girlfriend to come get us. When the girls showed up, we rushed out and got in the car without a word. They laughed at us and went in to go to the bathroom, so we went back in with them until they were done. Then we all went out together and left. We didn't even attempt to explain our behavior. Hog Hunt Horror. Coming up as a teenager, I did some really redneck things. My entire family was redneck anyway, and we didn't have a lot of money, so we did what anyone in our situation does. We grew food and hunted it. I have a cousin down by Broken Bow whose family runs hogs. I don't mean they raise them, I mean they hunt them. There are so many wild hogs down there that a lot of folks try to catch them so they can butcher them. It's been going on for decades. My grandpa talks about it a lot as well, though he doesn't do it anymore. One year when I was 15, my dad took me down there so we could get some pork to stock the freezer, as the venison was running out and we couldn't legally kill any deer for 6 months. We met up with my uncle and cousin at an Easy Mart in a little place called Ouchita, filled up on diesel and gas, diesel for our truck and gas for the ATVs, and headed into the hills. The idea was to camp out for a few nights and run the hogs at night with our dogs. Hog running is wild. Hogs are mean, and they are smart. They're hard to catch, too. A dog can get cut up pretty badly with wild hogs. A human can too, but typically things are fine by the time we catch up. The dogs chase them and either get them at bay or can actually latch onto them and hold them. It depends on the dog and it depends on the hog. Another thing to note is that in places like that part of Oklahoma, people can be pretty defensive about their territory. You're usually on public land, but people have areas they claim as their own for hog hunting. Some other people still catch wild hogs and notch the ears like they did back in the frontier days, and if they find you nabbing hogs with their notch or piglets off of one of their sows, they'll get touchy about it. We didn't feel like there was any valid claim to property when it came to feral pigs, so if our dogs got a hog, we killed it and took the meat no matter how the ears looked. We weren't looking for any trouble, though. It was our policy that if we ran into someone on a hog hunt who claimed the pig we were sticking, we'd give it to them. And if someone didn't like us being where we were, we'd go find a new spot. Luckily, my uncle knew the area and kept us mostly in places that weren't disputed. On this trip, our first night was pretty good, and we wound up with a couple of nice-sized hogs. We didn't scald them the way you normally would, but we had torches and scrapers to remove the scurf. Then we torched them again to burn the hair down and scrape it again. We spent the early morning doing that and gutting them up and cleaning them up, then parting them out for the coolers. We got everything tightly packed in bags and iced down, then we all went to sleep. For the second evening, we got up and decided to run over into a holler we hadn't been to before that was kind of remote. When we got out of the trucks and scouted around a touch, it looked promising. There was churned up earth where some hogs had been rooting around, so we got our guns and knives and lights and other gear and set the dogs on them. Away they went into the darkness, and we followed at a nice pace. We could sit and wait for the barking calls of the dogs, but we had nothing else to do but walk. It took quite a while for the dogs to get a scent strong enough to set them to the chase. Eventually they did, and we took off for the sound. It led us deeper and deeper up the holler, and the trees and underbrush started getting thick. The hillsides got rocky, and we started finding large boulders. "Hey, look at this," my dad said. We all turned and looked, and he had his headlamp shining on a flat face of a large boulder. There were scratches in it that looked like someone was trying to draw a picture, but had no idea how. It wasn't like claw marks, just random scratches going every which way. Some were straight and some were curved. After a minute we took off again, and the dogs started calling like they had something at bay. After another 15 minutes of running through the woods toward their sound, they broke out in an angry bark and growls, and then we could tell a fight had broken out. That's no good. Like I said, pigs can tear up a dog, so if they let one get into them, it could mess our night up. We didn't think we could run much harder, but we did, and as we came around a bend in the creek that cut down through the valley, we heard yelping and painful cries. The route we were taking turned uphill a bit, and after a minute we met one of our dogs running, or more like hobbling, downhill with blood all over its back and side. It had its tail between its legs. We tried to stop it and check it out, but it wouldn't stop. My cousin started back with it, and we moved on. It took us another 5 minutes to get to the scene. The fighting noises had stopped, but we could still hear sticks snapping and leaves shaking and some growling noises. We popped out into a little clearing in the woods, and there were the dogs, all lying on the ground dead. In the middle of the clearing was a dead pig, and a giant ape-like creature stooping over it, tearing flesh off it. The lights hit it, and it stood up and roared at us. My uncle and dad both fired their rifles at it, and it took off into the woods, still screaming. They covered me as I checked the dogs, and they were all for sure dead. We each grabbed one and took off for the pickups. Once there, we loaded up and drove back to camp. We just packed everything up and went home, and we have not chased hogs since. Stranger at our cabin. My family rented a cabin near Beaver's Bend State Park for a week one year. There are a lot of cabins down there, and usually they are fairly close together without being crowded. Some of them, however, are far apart. We got one that was back in the woods, completely surrounded by trees. No other cabin could be seen from there, and the only way in or out by vehicle was the gravel driveway that wound up and around a steep pine-covered slope. It was just what we were looking for. Before arriving for our vacation, we drove into the Pruitt's grocery store in Rochambeau and got a bunch of groceries. Then we made our way to the cabin and started unpacking. For our first night, we had a weenie roast outside around the fire pit, hung out in the hot tub a bit as night fell, then went in and played board games around the table. A few times in the night we heard thumps against the wall or out on the porch, but we didn't think that much about it. My dad said it was probably some raccoons playing around. We all went to bed around 11 o'clock. In the night I woke into the half-dream and half-reality paradox that always leaves me wondering if the sound I distinctly remember hearing was in my dream or something real that caused me to wake. I knew that I had heard tapping on the window to my room. I sat for several long moments and heard nothing further, so I looked at the window. The curtains were closed, and I could just see a shadow in the moonlight swaying across it. Scared at first, I realized it was just the shadow of a tree or something. I stared at it for some time and do not remember falling back asleep. On our first full day down there, we went into Beaver's Bend State Park and did some hiking. We ate a lunch of cheese and crackers and summer sausage in the park, looked around at the nature center and the visitor center, then went back to our cabin to relax. My brother and I took our baseball mitts out and started playing catch while my mom and dad sat on the porch drinking and watching us. At one point, my brother threw a pretty wild throw that tipped off my glove. It rolled over against the cabin and I went to fetch it. I swiped it off the ground and spun around to throw it when I noticed there were no trees on that side of the cabin for a long distance, and I was standing outside the window to my room. I turned back and looked at my window. There was nothing to see there, but it didn't seem possible to have any shadows over it unless the moon rose in the north. I wasn't really tall enough to look into the window either, since the cabin was kind of raised up on pylons with a rock wall built under it. Throwing the ball back to my brother, I held my hand up to say, "Don't throw it back," as I flipped my mitt off and ran over to my parents. I explained quickly that I thought something had been outside my window the night before and told them about thinking I heard tapping as well as the shadow. Dad kind of explained it off like it was my imagination, but he come over and looked around. There were scuff marks in the sparse grass near the window, but that could have been me. Without any clear evidence, there was nothing to do but move on. That night they cooked pork chops on the fire pit, but we ate inside. After dinner, the sun was down, and my brother asked if we could go get in the hot tub and drink sodas. I didn't like that idea, and I suppose it showed because my dad started reassuring me that nothing was going to happen and insisted we should go hang out in the hot tub. I finally relented, and we went. Our parents did hang out for a bit on the porch, but eventually went inside. I started telling my brother I was bored and wanted to go, but he didn't want to. I think he knew I was scared and was trying to mess with me. But then he gasped and froze. I looked around the direction he was looking and saw nothing at first. Then a shadow moved from the black stripe of one pine tree to the next. It was a large shape and was moving through the trees in an arc around the cabin, near where the flattish clearing the cabin was in broke off into a rocky and pine-covered hillside. We both clambered out of the hot tub, splashing water. I looked out as we ran up to the door, and the thing had stopped and was either facing toward us or away from us. Not being able to tell, I assumed it was facing us. We ran in, dripping water. My parents started to yell at us for not drying off, but my brother was panting and pointing and shouting about what we saw. Dad grabbed a flashlight and went to the door to look around, but he said he saw nothing. A mild scolding told us our parents didn't believe us, and we wound up pretending to read for a bit in the middle of the cabin. Then we went to bed. I snuck into my brother's room, though, and we slept on the floor. I fell asleep faster than I assumed I would, but then my brother woke me. "Do you hear that?" I listened for a moment, and I heard tapping. Quickly, I looked at the window, but there was no shadow there. The tapping was coming from somewhere else. It sounded like glass. We mustered up the courage to leave our bedroom to go wake our parents. Neither of us wanted to because we knew we'd get in trouble again, so we did our best to peek around the open front room where the kitchen and den and eating areas were in the cabin. Nothing seemed to be happening, and the tapping had stopped, so we just stood there for a few minutes. Tap, tap, tap. It started again and came from our left, front, near the sliding door to the porch. Tap, tap, tap. We didn't really see anything, but that was enough for us. Ducking into the master bedroom, we shook our parents awake and quickly explained it to them. Dad was furious, but also kept his cool. He got up and started walking out to prove to us there was nothing there. Mom was following him, with us right behind, still pleading our case. Dad flipped the hall light on and walked into the open area and toward the door to the porch. My brother's voice got high-pitched as Dad reached for the porch light. It just so happened that Dad turned his head to explain something to my brother as the light came on, and when it did, everyone but Dad screamed. Right behind Dad, through the sliding glass door, was a massive, dark, humanoid shape. Dad turned and backed away as the shape turned and ran through the open area around the house and into the woods. Mom and Dad ordered us to go start packing, and we did. We left that night and went into Broken Bow. There's an old motel that still had some rooms and a person working in the middle of the night. We got a single room. Dad called the cops and reported what had happened. The next day, the police and state park officials came out to take a statement from Dad. They acted like they didn't know much, and maybe they didn't yet, but as they were leaving, one of them said something about how it was a good thing we left. Dad asked him why, and the man was about to speak when another officer by their car yelled at him to come along. The second officer sounded angry. When we got home, my parents started doing searches for news stories from the area. The night before we left, a teenage girl and a dog went missing from a cabin a few miles from the one we were staying in. The night we left, another cabin had been vandalized, according to news, and the family staying there had left abruptly as well. As we dug into it, there were several stories of missing persons in the area going back several years. As far as we can tell, nobody has discovered the cause yet, and nobody seems to know what the giant, shadowy figure is. None of us felt like we got a good enough look at the thing to describe it. Looking back, my immediate thought is that maybe Bigfoot is real. However, it could have been a large person in very dirty and baggy clothing. We saw it in the porch light, but there was glare off the glass door, and the thing was moving quickly. Regardless, something was harassing us, and there are enough incidents in that area that I don't care to ever go back, regardless of how beautiful the landscape is. Panhandle. The Oklahoma Panhandle is a part of the state that most of us don't give much thought to. If you've been there, you will probably describe it as flat, bleak, empty, and windy. It is all of those things. It was called no man's land for some time, after all. There isn't much difference between the Oklahoma Panhandle, the North Texas Panhandle, and Southwest Kansas. However, that empty flatness can offer some interesting experiences. For one, there is very little light and noise pollution, and if you want to watch a meteor shower, those aren't bad places to camp out at night. Additionally, the flat emptiness can be extremely eerie. The highest point in Oklahoma is at the very west end of the Panhandle and is partially in New Mexico. Additionally, the nearest town, Kenton, is the only town in Oklahoma that is in mountain time. Black Kettle Ghost. Some friends and I were trying to mix up our camping spots right before we graduated college. We'd been camping in a number of locations in the eastern half of the state and wanted a change of pace. One friend suggested going to the Black Kettle WMA. The rest of us saw that it was on the western edge of Oklahoma and that the landscape was different than we were used to, so we agreed. Then we learned that you can primitive camp in a number of locations and decided to try it. We would have to pack everything in and everything out. There would be no tables, no toilets, no benches, no chairs. We decided to kick off our dead week before finals with a long weekend. Early Saturday morning, we took off and got there before lunch. The idea was to hike out into the grassland and find a place with water and some trees so we could stretch out some hammocks and rain tarps and pump plenty of water. Then we'd just hang out till Tuesday morning, pack up, and head home. That would give us the end of the week to study, and a couple of the guys would pick up shifts at work as well. It wasn't the most responsible plan, but we all had jobs lined up starting the week after graduation, so it was the best we felt we could do. Not familiar with the area at all, it took us some time to even find a place that looked like it would be good to park and walk from. Part of the problem is that we didn't want to be within sight of our cars, so it was a bit hard to know from the road where a good place to camp would be. However, we found a place that looked like we could follow a creek, and those will usually have some trees here and there. Parking the car, we got our packs out, double-checked the water and a few items we knew we absolutely must have, battery packs for charging phones, camp stools, snacks, and a couple of beers each, and then we set out down the creek. It was nearly sundown before we found the perfect spot. The creek wound down between two small hills, or rather just slight rises in the land, and there were a handful of decent-sized trees lining both sides and spread out in a bit of a low spot. It was protected just enough from the wind. Since we were hammock camping, we each just started setting up our own gear, and in the end we had a semicircle in the trees with hammocks all around and a pile of rocks in the center to light a fire in. We used a camp shovel to clear out the grass and sticks in the wide area around the fire. One of my friends made it clear that we could never leave the fire or even coals going without someone awake and alert to watch it. The rest of us agreed, some perhaps begrudgingly. Then we ate some quick snacks and cracked open our first beer each and watched stars and meteors. It was a beautiful night, at least once the air cooled off from the hot day. Bugs were a problem, but we had some 100% DEET to help, though it wasn't 100% effective. We all went to our hammocks and fell asleep about midnight. Sometime later I woke up with heartburn and the urge to urinate. I wiggled out of my bag and swung out of my hammock, shook out my shoes really well, put them on, and staggered over to a tree. I was standing there peeing when I looked up at the night sky and saw a soft white ball of light moving somewhat slowly through the air. It wasn't quite overhead, but off to my north a little. At first I thought it was a satellite, but it was far too large. It moved about that speed. I was not alarmed because I don't really believe in the supernatural, and it seemed there had to be some kind of explanation for it. It actually sank kind of low on the horizon, like it was going off into the west, except it looked basically the same size. Then it stopped and just hung in the air. Now I was perplexed. The ball wavered in the air for a moment, shimmering, and then it faded away. Looking around, I saw nothing else out of the ordinary. I noticed it was eerily quiet, but I still didn't feel any alarm or danger. For a couple of minutes I stood there until I heard a coyote start yapping very close. That scared me for a split second until I recognized what it was. The entire pack started yipping, and I went and lay back down. The next day I told my friends about the light, and they didn't really believe me. We explored the area a little till it got too hot, then we just sat around camp talking. I brought up the light again, and one of them started making fun of me for seeing things. I started to wonder if I had. Uneventful as the day was, it seemed to last forever. Eventually, the sun went down and we took our camp stools up to the top of a rise and sat there watching the sun go down and the stars come out. Once it was good and dark, we decided to go stoke the fire and sit around it. On our way down the hill, two of my friends exclaimed at the same time. Me and the other one looked around and saw there was a ball of light floating about 20 yards off. It looked to be that close at least, but we didn't know for sure. We all just stared, but it faded away within 30 seconds or so. Of course, the conversation started pretty quickly, and they all acknowledged they saw it. We got to the campsite and lit a fire and talked about what we saw and what it could be for a couple of hours. We finally got too tired to stay up, and we drowned the fire and went to sleep. Once again, I woke up needing to pee, so I got up, and as I ducked under the end of my tarp, I saw one of my friends standing beside the fire, which was crackling with a few small flames, but many bright coals. "What are you doing up?" I whispered as loud as I could. My voice sounded incredibly loud in the dark. My friends didn't budge. I forgot I needed to pee and walked up to the fire, looking down into the coals. I reached my hands out and felt the heat. The night wasn't cold, but the warmth of the fire felt good. "Really? What are you doing up?" Still nothing. The night was dead quiet again. I looked over at my friend, and nobody was there. Looking around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. That is, except the fire. I decided someone was playing a prank on me, so I went to the other hammocks one by one and woke up my friends. They all swore they had been asleep. They were mad at me. I eventually got them all roused and standing outside and asked them which one lit the fire. Nobody fessed up. They all assumed I did it and that I was trying to scare them. Arguing ensued and got loud until we finally all decided to go to bed. Once again, we drowned the fire and hit the sack. I remember waking up once more to the sound of coyotes and frogs, but it was a half dream. Our last day camping was much the same. We were all a bit tired, and I could tell they were all annoyed at me, so I didn't bring up any lights or fire or anything. In the evening, I didn't even suggest lighting the fire. I waited till someone else lit it. We ate the last of our proper food and drank our last beer each and sat around in mostly silence. Eventually, someone started a conversation about what tests were coming up next week and how much we had to study, what everyone's grades were, and what they had to score on the final to secure that letter grade. And once again, we all meandered off to bed about the same time. This last night, I didn't wake up to urinate, but I did snap awake as if I'd heard a noise. I didn't remember hearing one, but I was asleep, then suddenly alert. Through the tarp that was hung over the ridgeline, I could see light dancing from our fire pit. Someone had gotten up and lit the fire again. Once again, I slipped into my shoes and out of my hammock, ducked out of the tarp, and saw a dark shape standing by the fire. I approached slowly this time and kept my eyes on the shape. If it was one of my friends, they were standing on something, and draped in thick cloth or something. They were tall and appeared to be wrapped in a robe or blanket. By the time I was standing by the fire, I still could not make out a face, but I still did not feel like I was in danger. However, I was extremely unsettled because this didn't make sense. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked. I had no idea what else to say, but I couldn't just stand there. I really wanted to know what was going on. The shape disappeared. Right in front of my eyes, it faded without moving. I stood there, dumbfounded. I had to be dreaming. Was I hallucinating? I felt awake. Even now I remember it as if it actually happened. I heard a noise and looked to see one of my friends making their way out of their hammock set up and over toward me. I looked back at the fire. "Hey, what's going on?" my friend asked. I couldn't move. The sound came to my mind as if through a thick wall. My brain was foggy and I wasn't responding. I could see my friend's feet standing beside the fire ring we had made, but I couldn't even look up. The next thing I can remember in my mind is waking up in my hammock to the light of the sun brightening all of my surroundings. I snapped awake. I jumped out of the hammock and didn't bother putting my shoes on. I got a stick or a thorn in my foot, but still hobbled out to the center of our camp. The fire was burned down, only ash remained. All the logs we had stacked up were gone. More curious, all my friends were approaching the fire at the same time. I was sure I'd had a crazy dream and all the rest was just coincidence, but one questioning look at my closest friend, and I knew it had actually happened. His eyes were wide and wild. For a few seconds we looked at each other in turn, and we all knew we wanted to leave as fast as possible. Without a word, we all started packing up, and we walked out without looking back. The drive home started quietly, but eventually the driver got up the nerve to ask, "You all woke up last night, right?" Black Mesa. Ben and his wife, Sam, finally made it to the top of the mesa, drenched in sweat, and stopped to sit on a rock to catch their breath and get a drink of water. Ahead they saw another hiker moving slowly along the path. "I didn't see any other cars down there, did you?" Sam looked at him with a confused look, and he nodded up ahead to the hiker. She followed his look and understood the question, but just shrugged. It seemed dumb to waste breath on talking about things that didn't matter when she was still trying to catch it. Ben started looking around at the arid land north and west of the mesa. They had already found some dinosaur footprints and looked around a dry creek area and had some lunch. Now it was late afternoon and they just wanted to look around the flat top of the highest point in Oklahoma, then hike back down to make the long drive back to Boise City where they had a hotel room. After a few moments they got up and continued walking along the trail. It curved off to the west and they soon came to a bench with a pillar marking the state line boundary with New Mexico. They sat for a moment and drank some more water. However, they both started feeling drowsy in the hot autumn air. "We should really go back," Sam said, but quietly, and Ben didn't respond. Deep blue light was crowding the eastern half of the sky when they woke up. Ben stretched, then panicked a bit, and started looking around. As his head swiveled around to the west, his peripheral vision picked up the bright orange and pink and purple of the sunset, but the sun was already down. Sam was looking around the other direction, and her peripheral vision picked up a figure walking from the west up behind them. She assumed it was the hiker they saw earlier. Simultaneously they stood, and simultaneously they turned around and looked toward the sunset. The figure coming at them looked up, and it appeared to be wearing a deer skull on its head. It was tall. Antlers came out from it, but they had something hanging from them. "Let's go," Sam said. "Let's." They turned and started walking as fast as they dared. After only 30 seconds or so, Sam looked back. "Ben?" she said. He looked back and saw the figure was closing. It had extremely long legs and a very long stride. For the first time, Ben noticed it had longer arms than it should. Failing light made it hard to know for sure, but it didn't look natural. They picked up their speed, but so did it. Then between their own panting breath, they heard distant chanting. At the point where the trail broke and went down to the Mesa base, Ben paused and let Sam go down first. For that brief moment he waited, he looked back, and the figure was there, only a few yards back. It had clawed hands, and the legs were backward. "Run!" he hissed. Sam took off, skidding down the slope and sending rocks tumbling. Ben was right behind her, trying to keep an eye on the figure, but also trying not to slide into his wife. At the base, they took a peek back and the figure was gone, but they both broke into a full run down the trail. It wound around the north side of the mesa to the parking lot. They approached the lot panting and fear-stricken. Ben was fumbling for his keys and heard a coyote yap atop the mesa. Then he heard a grunt and a growl, one and the same, come from his right. Beep, beep! The locks disengaged on the car and Sam headed for the passenger side as he went around it. A tall figure strode out from the dark shadows at the base of the mesa and came straight for them. Sam screamed and Ben jumped in. He fired the car up, quietly thanked his dad for teaching him to properly maintain his vehicles, slammed it in reverse and gave it more gas than it needed. He didn't wait for it to come to a stop before shifting into drive, and then he floored it. Something hit the side of the car with a loud thump that mixed with the screaming tires. The car shook side to side. Ben got the impression of a shape chasing them in his outside mirror, and he looked over his shoulder. The rear side window was spiderwebbed. An unworldly scream chased them out of the parking lot, and he slid onto the county road and headed back to Highway 325. It was a long and twisted road in places. Ben nearly slid off a couple of times, but Sam put her hand on his arm. "It's okay." He slowed down. They made it back to the highway and turned back east. Ben rolled his window down to get some air. The full moon was rising, and over the sound of the wind blowing into the car, they both heard a distant, animalistic scream from the direction of Black Mesa. Wheat harvest. My family has a large farm in northwest Oklahoma with parts in Kansas. We raise cattle, hay, and wheat mostly. When it is time to work cattle, plant, or harvest, things get extremely busy, especially harvest. Slave to the seasons and the weather and the markets, when it's time to harvest wheat, you have to harvest wheat. Often, we have to beat storms into the field, and if you wait too long, you lose money every time. Therefore, when the wheat heads are ready for cutting, you cut if you can, no matter what, and you cut all night if you must. Typically, we run a herd of combines and trucks in shifts. My mom brings out lunch and dinner, we cut into the night, then we take a break of a few hours to sleep in a travel trailer, grab a quick snack for breakfast, and hit the fields again. We swap out who's driving combines and who's driving trucks. The combine drivers just cut long, straight rows in the field, and when they're getting close to full, they radio a truck or flash the lights if a truck is close, and the truck drives up beside them to transfer the grain while the combine keeps cutting. Then the truck heads to the town with the grain elevator we're selling to, or to the farm if we're keeping the grain, and transfers it to the bins. Now that I'm older and have moved away, I take a large chunk of my vacation every summer to go home and help with harvest. When I was in college, my folks paid me to come home for the summer just to help with getting the equipment ready for harvest, then harvesting. Harvest is stressful, but it is rewarding once it's done. We all enjoy it. There's nothing like greasing up bearings when the sun comes up and watching the sun go down behind a spinning header. But the job is tiring, and you are alone for long periods of time. That is the stage for this story. My dad had told me of times he'd seen strange things in the field at night, but he seemed to believe it was just from stress and lack of sleep. The world shrinks to a spot of earth in front of the machine that is mostly golden grass sweeping into the mouth of the combine because that's all you can see beside the lit gauges in the cab. Mosquitoes and grasshoppers and other insects swarm the combine lights and bounce off the glass, and that's about all that can wake you up from the drone of the engine. Therefore, it stands to reason that someone might see strange things from time to time. One summer, toward the end of harvest, we had all our large fields done except the one we were in. We had just stopped for a quick bite as the sun was disappearing over the horizon. We had a few smaller fields nearby, odd triangles tucked between roads and rivers, strips near town that were crowded between buildings and plots such as that. There was an hour or so of cutting left in the large field we were in, but we decided it would be most efficient to have the other two combines rode over to start cutting smaller fields, and I could finish the big one. We all set out, and my combine was mostly empty, so the trucks could make a run to town. I was all alone. For 30 minutes, all was well. And then suddenly a shape darted into the light in front of my machine from left to right. I assumed it was a deer, but I jumped and tried to shut down the header and put the brakes on. I didn't get it done in time, and I hit whatever it was. Shutting the machine down, I left the lights on and grabbed a flashlight. I wasn't looking forward to getting whatever it was out of the header, but I had to. I climbed down the ladder from the cab and moved around the large front wheel and the left side of the header that stuck way out. I couldn't see anything in it, but I shined the light up under the reel. Nothing was there. There was nothing but plant matter in the cutting bar either. I shined the light around the field a bit, but couldn't see anything. Strangely, there were no bent or broken wheat stems off to either side. A deer would make at least some kind of slight path through the plants. Certain my imagination had been playing tricks on me, I went back and fired the machine back up and took off cutting. Finishing that pass, I turned around and started back on the opposite course, and then something popped out again, from right to left. I stopped again, but just sat in the cab, looking down at the header. I was in roughly the same part of the field as before. I got down from the cab, but left the engine running. There was nothing in front of the machine, nothing under the machine, nothing to either side of the machine. I took off again. Nothing happened on the next pass, which seemed to confirm to me that I was imagining things. But on the fourth pass, I saw it again. I could not tell what it was. It was gray, and it moved fast. I didn't want to get out, but I felt I had to check, so I did. Once again, there was nothing in the header. I shined the light around the field and was about to give up again and go back to the combine, promising myself not to bother stopping next time when the light caught something out in the field. 2 bright spots, yellow, shone back at me. The light had just swept past, and it startled me, so I moved the light back to them again. For a split second they were there, then they disappeared as the head ducked down. It was the face of a girl, and the face and hair were gray. I called out but received no answer. "Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. "Come on, get out of there." Nothing. I walked out into the wheat, careful not to crush too much of it. There was nothing that I could see near the spot I thought I'd seen the girl, and no sign of anyone having been there. Then the door of the combine closed, and the light shut off. I turned and yelled and ran back over to it. Shining the light of the cab, I could not see anything in it at all. I climbed the ladder and opened the door. Nobody was in there. It was a freak thing. A breeze shut the door, and the thump must have rocked the light switch. I turned the lights on and wiggled the switch. It was solid. I flipped the lights off and on a couple of times. Finally, I decided it was high time to move on, so I turned the header back on, put the machine in gear, and took off. As soon as I looked up, I saw the girl run right into the header. A blood-curdling scream erupted all around me, and a flurry of insects seemed to attack the windows of the cab from all sides. I shut it down again and, nervously, got out and investigated the header. There was nothing there, as I suspected, and I quickly jumped back into the cab and took off again. I radioed my dad and told him to come over as soon as he could. He said he was on his way, thinking I had a full load to transfer. I never saw anything else that night. When Dad got there, he was a bit annoyed at me not being full, so begrudgingly, I told him what I saw. I expected him to make fun of me or tell me I was just making things up, or maybe that I was seeing things from being tired, but he let me finish, and he just nodded. "I've seen her before." "You have?" "Yes, a couple of times. Once in the North Creek place, and once out on the highway, both times running out in front of me." "What is it?" "A ghost, I suppose. I don't really know." We talked for a few more minutes, and then he jumped in the cab and took over. I rode with him till that field was done, and then we drove everything over to the nearest field where my brother was finishing up. The wheat harvest was wrapped up that night, and I was happy about it. When the next summer was approaching, I remember being nervous about going to help, but my mom and dad were counting on me, so I did. I called my dad one day to tell him about my concerns, and he understood, but he reminded me that the ghost never did much but run out in front of machines. I asked about the door and the lights. "Just don't stop harvesting unless you really see something, okay?" I guess that's easier said than done, but we have to get the wheat harvested. About the author. You don't really want to waste your time learning anything about the author. He's not an interesting person. Thank you for listening to this collection of short stories. I hope it was entertaining. That was the goal. This has been a huge project I've been working on for quite some time, collecting stories, rewriting stories, compiling them, all that good stuff, doing the audio recording and work. I don't do great audio work. I'm not trained in this kind of stuff, but just trying to get the audio put together, either drawing, painting, or collecting images. A lot of the images that you saw were AI generated, and a lot of them aren't that great. I just wanted something in there for background imagery, and hopefully it didn't detract from the story too much. And in some cases, I do think that it enhanced the storytelling just a little bit if you were able to watch the video rather than listen to just the audio. But anyway, it's a lot of work. I hope it was enjoyable. It was fun to put together, and I look forward to doing more of this in the future because this was a little bit of an experiment in a number of ways. And anyway, we'll see what happens from it. So if you did enjoy it, like, subscribe, send thanks, whatever, join the channel. I know this is quite a bit different than the normal things that I do on my YouTube channel. But I'm interested in a lot of different things, and I do a lot of different hobbies and try a lot of different stuff out. So anyway, this is one of them. Thanks again, and I hope you have a very fun October, a fun Halloween, and a great end of the year. See ya.